perspectives on how China's influence is affecting Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, and how the United States can best advance our shared interest in regional peace and prosperity. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about these and other challenges posed by China's activities and specific steps Congress can take to address them. I will now turn the floor over to my co-chair for this hearing, Vice Chair Randall Schreiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, and thank you to our witnesses. Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands are home to nearly 700 million people. Collectively, if taken together, would constitute the 5th largest economy in the world. And as Chair Price mentioned, they occupy strategic geography straddling these key sea lanes which connect the Indian Ocean to the Western Pacific. It's also quite diverse. It's a broad range of development. This region is bookended by Laos with an annual income of around $3,000 US, and Singapore, which is closer to $70,000. There's different systems of governance in the region, ranging from thriving democracies like the Philippines to very oppressive regimes like the one in Myanmar. And it's diverse in terms of religion. The world's most populous Muslim country, Indonesia, is in the region. And the 2 countries with the highest percentage of Catholics outside the Vatican are in this region, in Timor-Leste and the Philippines. The United States has a broad spectrum of bilateral relationships with countries and territories in this region. There are U.S. territories where American citizens reside. There are states where we have compacts of free association. There are treaty allies, including some of which we have persistent military presence. There's important trade and security partners like Singapore, where we have a free trade agreement and U.S. forces have ready access there. And there are countries with whom we have very strained ties like Myanmar. Beyond this story of great diversity, there is one common quality that these countries all share, and that is the proximity to China. And that affects virtually all aspects of the lives of the citizens in these 2 regions. Proximity to China affects trade and investment patterns and shifting supply chains. It impacts the degree to which Chinese organized crime is a disruptive factor. It brings threats to food security and climate patterns. And most acutely, it affects security. Each country in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands is well within range of the People's Liberation Army's most common and plentiful power projection capabilities, their ballistic and cruise missiles. And many have been directly bullied and coerced by the PLA Navy, Coast Guard, and/or maritime militia. So the United States must compete and compete smartly. In the Pacific Islands, this means paying particular attention to the issues they care about, such as climate change, transnational crime, corruption, and protection of fisheries. In Southeast Asia, it means balancing a strong security role where we have traditionally upheld deterrence and secured the free and open maritime commons. Balance that with robust development, trade, and investment strategies that lift all. Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands are demographically populous and young, so we must have a strategy that is appropriate for the long term. And this strategy should display our values as well as prove the United States to be a durable and reliable partner. I look forward to exploring these issues today and learning more from our expert witnesses.
So our first panel will examine China's strategic objectives in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands and the extent to which they have been successful in engaging countries in the region diplomatically. We'll start with Dr. Prashanth Parameswaran, Global Fellow at the Wilson Center. Dr. Parameswaran's testimony will evaluate the overall strategic competition between China and the United States in Southeast Asia. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Lynn Kuok, Kuan Yu Chair in Southeast Asia Studies at Brookings Institution. Dr. Kuok will discuss shifts in how elites and the public in Southeast Asia view China and the United States. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Graham Smith, Senior Fellow at Australian National University, joining us remotely. Thank you for joining us from across the world. Dr. Smith will examine China's strategic objectives and diplomatic activities in the Pacific Islands and efforts of the United States and its allies and partners to counter China's growing influence. Thank you all very much for your testimony. The Commission is looking forward to your remarks. I ask that all of our witnesses please keep your remarks to 7 minutes, and Dr. Parameswaran will begin with you.
Great. Thank you so much to the Commission for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony makes 3 basic points. My first point is that the United States and China are engaged in high-stakes asymmetric competition in Southeast Asia. In my trips to all of the 11 countries in Southeast Asia over the past 2 years, except Myanmar, policymakers acknowledge competition as a new normal. There are also worries that an excessive focus on competition will complicate other priorities, such as domestic growth. Within this competition, the United States is recognized as the leading security provider with an unmatched alliance network. But economically, China has a nearly 2-to-1 advantage on the United States in terms of trade. It is also closing the gap on investment where American companies have led. China wants to entrench itself as the leading power in Southeast Asia at the expense of the United States. Chinese officials openly say this in the region. In recent months, some have indicated they sense a window of opportunity for China to make inroads in Southeast Asia if the United States is distracted from the region. As one Chinese diplomat told Southeast Asian countries recently at a regional forum, China sees itself as the most leading partner in ASEAN and, quote unquote, the self-evident choice for the region. A Southeast Asia dominated by China would undermine US interests in a significant region in its own right. Southeast Asia is the world's 5th largest economy and 3rd largest population center in the world, hosting critical sea lanes and the Indo-Pacific's default diplomatic convener, ASEAN. All countries in the region recognize the need to live with China, but none of them see it in their interest to be dominated by China. Many of them also worry about shifts in US commitment to the region when a new administration takes office. We have seen some of that at play in recent weeks. My second point is that China has made gains, but the region and other powers are not standing still. It is impossible to miss China's footprint when traveling and operating in Southeast Asia. China's presence is highly visible across media, digital payments, electric vehicles, and infrastructure. But these gains also need to be kept in perspective. I had the opportunity to ride Southeast Asia's first high-speed rail project in Indonesia, built by China last November. It was visually impressive, as the headlines suggest, but there were also major delays in some of the stations that local Indonesians complained about as well. When I spoke with small restaurant owners in Laos operating next to the Mekong River, they were acutely aware of China's negative influence on food and water security. Countries also recognize that China's growing presence intensifies the need for them to diversify their options to prevent over-reliance. The good news here is that more powers beyond China are doing more in Southeast Asia. That includes US partners like Australia, India, and Japan. Southeast Asia countries themselves are also exerting their own agency in some cases. Singapore is a leader in minilateral partnerships in the digital and green economy. Vietnam's proliferating trade agreements have intensified the friendly but often fierce intra-regional competition in Southeast Asia with major economies like Malaysia and Thailand. But alternatives are not always available for smaller countries in the region like Laos. And policymakers in Southeast Asia concede privately that politicians may go for cheap and quick options from China that benefit regime interests, but do not benefit national interests. My third and final point is that the United States should focus on what I call an affirmative swing sector competitive approach in the region. And Congress has a key and critical role to play in this approach. I continue to believe that the United States should ideally pursue full spectrum competition, at the very least across all 4 letters of the acronym DIME: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. At the same time, given constraints on time and resources, there is also a need to focus on a core value proposition within this comprehensive approach. In my view, that focus should be on providing options and shaping choices Southeast Asian states are making in a narrower set of significant strategic industries. To my mind, this is more preferable to a focus on just a few quote-unquote swing states in US-China competition that some have advocated, which ignores the full range of countries in a diverse and dynamic region. Designated priorities should focus on areas like technology, strategic infrastructure, the maritime domain, and sustainable approaches to managing critical minerals and rare earths. Congress has an important role to play in at least 3 particular areas across and beyond these sectors. The first area is scrutinizing interagency coordination and focus. In complex areas like technology, even some US partners have a really difficult time figuring out areas with respect to interagency coordination and focus, including getting clarity on what the right mix of agencies are to structure cooperation across administrations. More able partners like Singapore have been able to navigate this, but frankly, this is a high bar, and ongoing changes to areas like US international assistance may make this even more challenging. The second area is ensuring key sectors are prioritized in budgeting. Regional funding for maritime domain awareness is especially critical for issues like the South China Sea and should be distributed across key regional countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia, even as the Philippines remains a priority. The third and final area is ensuring a focus on ASEAN, which, for all of its flaws, which are recognized in the region, give US policy one way to engage across all 11 countries in a diverse region in a resource-constrained environment. Engagements with the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, paired with CODELs and part of standalone visits, is one way to address this. And I applaud the Commission's own recent visit to the ASEAN Secretariat this month, broadcasted on the Secretariat's social media, as one example of this. There are other examples as well, including holding US-ASEAN summits in the United States to get past the issue of presidential engagement on an annual basis in the region. Thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to the rest of the panel and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Kuok.
Thank you so much. Co-chairs Price and Shriver, distinguished commissioners, USCC staff, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important topic of US-China strategic competition in Southeast Asia. The United States has prioritized the Indo-Pacific, but is ceding influence to China in Southeast Asia, a region at its geographic heart. With about 700 million people, a fast-growing market, and vital sea lanes, Southeast Asia is central to US Indo-Pacific strategy. Unlike other sub-regions identified in the US Indo-Pacific strategy, however, Southeast Asia's geographical proximity to China dovetails with rising levels of Chinese influence, making it a weak link in US engagement in the Indo-Pacific. In September last year, I published a piece in Foreign Affairs entitled, "America is Losing Southeast Asia." I chose the title partly to focus minds, but also because it captured regional sentiment. Just before its publication, I was speaking to a senior regional diplomat, and he, unaware of the title of my publication, told me that if the United States is not careful, it will lose Southeast Asia. Now, this does not mean that the US position in the region is irreversible, at least not yet. Through decades of providing a security counterweight, the US has contributed to the region's peace and prosperity and is very much valued for it, even as these contributions have also benefited the United States. Even today, Southeast Asia does not want to choose between the United States and China, and without strong US engagement, the region's strategic options will shrink and China's influence will grow. And of course, a US loss does not mean a Chinese win. As Prashant pointed out earlier, Southeast Asia is diversifying its partnerships. However, given its proximity, its economic clout, and its sustained diplomacy in the region, China stands to benefit most from reduced US engagement. Now, I think it's important to ask at the outset what the United States' strategic vision for the region is. Does it remain to outcompete China? Or is Washington considering a grand bargain or a comprehensive economic deal with China that some are talking about, which could make Washington more amenable to accommodating Beijing's concerns, whether it's on Japan and the South China Sea, Japan and the East China Sea, Taiwan, the South China Sea, or the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty? Further, do allies and partners play an important role in US strategic vision? Now, for the purpose of this testimony, I assume that Washington's strategic vision remains unchanged, though that's not entirely clear to me. And recent developments suggest otherwise, at least that the strategic vision is contested. Now, on US influence. In 2024, for the first time in an annual survey of government and non-government elites, China overtook the United States as the preferred alignment partner if countries were forced to choose. 50.5% chose China, while 49.5% chose the United States. Now, this edge was slim, but a breakdown of results by country reveals a sharp decline in US support. In Malaysia and Indonesia, two countries with which the United States seek closer ties under the US Indo-Pacific strategy, support for the United States dropped by a full 20 percentage points. In Thailand, a US treaty ally, the drop was nearly 10 percentage points. The decline was even steeper in Laos, where China has been actively engaging in the country. The support there was 30 percentage points. This was followed by Cambodia with an 18 percentage point drop, Brunei with 15, and Myanmar with 10. Only in 3 countries out of ASEAN's 10 countries did the United States show gains, but these were small. And these countries were the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. Now, 2 key factors explain the shift in the region. First, the Gaza crisis. This was likely the tipping point. In Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei, all Muslim-majority countries, nearly between 70 and 75% of respondents preferred alignment with China. And you would note that all 3 countries are countries with which countries that have a dispute with China in the South China Sea. Nearly half of all respondents in the survey, moreover, ranked Israel-Hamas conflict as their top geopolitical concern, surpassing even the geographically more proximate South China Sea dispute. The numbers were even higher in Muslim-majority countries. The second factor on declining US influence is weak US economic engagement. China has outperformed the United States in trade, multilateral engagement, and infrastructure development. Since 2009, China has been ASEAN's largest trading partner. Meanwhile, the United States' credibility has eroded due to its withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and ongoing uncertainty over whether the United States will pull out of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The United States has also struggled to compete with China in infrastructure development. Efforts such as the BUILD Act in 2018, the Blue Dot Network in 2019, the Build Back Better World Initiative in 2021, which was later rebranded as the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, have yet to yield tangible results in Southeast Asia. And some in the region, in fact, wonder whether the emperor has any clothes. China, in contrast, despite criticism and despite delays, has delivered major projects like the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail in Indonesia and the Botan-Vientiane railway in Laos, both of which are not perfectly operational, but nonetheless operational. While regional countries remain cautious about economic dependence and strategic risks, they nonetheless welcome much-needed infrastructural investment. In Indonesia, plans are underway to extend the high-speed rail network across Java, potentially connecting Jakarta and Surabaya. The United States remains the largest source of foreign investment in the region, but much of this investment is concentrated in Singapore, and China is rapidly closing the gap in FDI levels. Adding to the drop in U.S. influence is inconsistent U.S. diplomacy. Beijing's actions in the South China Sea remain the main obstacle to its greater influence, but it has been remarkably effective at minimizing fallout through economic incentives and diplomatic outreach. Finally, a growing perception of U.S. Unreliability is setting in. Many Asian countries are watching U.S. security commitments in Europe and questioning whether Washington can be counted on in a crisis. The Philippines, in this respect, is particularly exposed. Restoring U.S. influence requires a comprehensive, coherent, and sustained strategy. My written testimony details policy and legislative recommendations in 3 key areas. Deepening U.S. economic engagement, Washington must expand trade ties, sustain its commitment to IPEF, and support infrastructure investment in strategic sectors like digital connectivity and critical minerals. Resources to the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation should be increased to incentivize private sector investment in regional infrastructure. Additionally, U.S. aid funding should prioritize initiatives that more directly align with U.S. strategic interests, such as maritime security, capacity building, and digital infrastructure. Second, the United States should strengthen its alliances and partnerships. It needs to reaffirm security commitments, increase defense cooperation, and avoid coercive diplomacy. That will be essential to retaining trust. And finally, the U.S. leadership the United States should lead on defending international law and maritime rights. U.S. leadership on the South China Sea and a firm commitment to upholding UNCLOS are critical to maintaining regional stability. Importantly, framing choices in terms of international law, not as a binary choice between the United States and China, makes it easier for regional governments to align with Washington. I would refer the commissioners to my written testimony for further details. Now, to conclude very briefly, expanding U.S. influence in Southeast Asia requires a clear strategic vision and a coherent approach. But even the best crafted strategies require political will. I return to the question I posed at the outset: what is the U.S. strategic vision for the region? And if it remains to restore influence and to outcompete China, then Washington must act now, and it must act with its allies and partners. Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, once observed that Asia is not a movie that the United States can pause and expect its ability to shape the region's strategic trajectory to remain unchanged. His words remained as relevant today as ever. The U.S. and the region are at a turning point. And I will close with the title of my written testimony: America First cannot mean America alone. This was also the title of an article that I published in 2016, 6 months before H.R. McMaster and Gary Cohen wrote a piece similarly entitled, America First Doesn't Mean America Alone. If Washington fails to recognize the strategic importance of its alliances and partnerships, it risks becoming a power that knows the cost of everything, but the value of nothing. Without allies and partners, Washington's leadership in Asia and globally will erode, leaving America weak abroad and poorer at home. Thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Smith.
Unmute myself so I don't make the most common Zoom mistake ever. Thank you so much for being here for this hearing, and I'm really grateful to be asked to talk about the Pacific. I'll do my best to represent an incredibly diverse region. To slightly correct the co-chair, the poorest country of both regions is actually Kiribati, with a GDP just over $2,000. So unfortunately, the Pacific bookends the region in a not very positive way. So where to begin? Apologies firstly for all the footnotes in my testimony. I'm an academic, it's a bit of a disease. The framework of losing the Pacific, probably in the next section you're going to get chapter and verse about who's lost the Pacific, and you'll probably be told Australia and New Zealand have lost the Pacific and the US must save the Pacific from China. It's a really unhelpful way to talk about the region. Pacific people can listen to this broadcast too, and as soon as you talk about the Pacific, something that might be lost behind the couch, they tend to tune out and ignore any efforts to engage with them. Because if you're engaging purely for geostrategic reasons, purely to keep China out or to block them, then the region is just not interested. It has a long history of being involved in the non-aligned movement. Yes, phrases like friends to all, enemies to none do sound incredibly silly, but to quote my fellow sort of testimony from Dr. Kuok there, she uses this great phrase, forcing a choice on Southeast Asia risks backfiring, driving countries in the region closer to Beijing. You could substitute the Pacific for Southeast Asia and get exactly the same problem. So tone really matters, as well as substance and consistency. The region was already a little bit orange about the US and its commitment to the region, and the current administration seems to be enforcing the fears that the US doesn't have a consistent strategy for the region. But also respect about the way you approach the region and having the patience to listen to what the Pacific is actually concerned about. Obviously, climate change, transnational crime, and fisheries, the last two are areas that the current administration will not have problems acting on. The first one, obviously, there's an issue there. Now, I'll talk briefly about trends about China in the region that we've been observing over the last 15 years as our research team's been looking at them. You're getting a lot more serious Chinese diplomats in the region. You didn't see this under Hu Jintao. They tended to send people there as sort of a punishment post, but now you're getting some much more serious people there. When I was first sort of engaging with the Ministry of Commerce in China in the Pacific, they sent this guy out to write up the country plan for Tonga. Until a full week before he was arriving in Tonga, he thought he was going to Togo. So since 2013, when that happened, China's come a very long way. You have serious investment in Pacific languages, in Pacific research expertise, and a serious effort to sort of influence Pacific academics and Pacific media. On the diplomatic side, they're also showing a really interesting tendency to go beyond the usual. They're targeting traditional chiefs, they're targeting religious groups, areas that they just simply weren't aware of 15 years ago. They're now sort of flying chiefs out to China and giving them sort of full 2-week tours, something that I don't think happens in the US or even in Australia. Another big change is that the companies have always been the big player in the Pacific, these state-owned companies such as China Civil Engineering Corporation. These ones have really taken on a quite prominent geopolitical role. CCECC played a role in switching Solomon Islands from Taiwan to China. They literally flew out to meet with Sogavare and his retinue and basically put $500 million on the table and said, you know what you need to do. And they then went and did it. Now, other huge changes are on the security side. Everyone worries about bases, but the big shift is that China now pitches itself as the internal security partner of choice for the Pacific. It's offering policing initiatives and it's offering an alternative model, if you like, of how people can be governed. It's also very much about policing their own diaspora. So they have significant diaspora populations in many Pacific nations, and they're not very trusting of them. So the police aren't just there to further international gains. They're also there for domestic political stability reasons. The narrative side, again, I echo what Dr. Kuok had to say about Gaza. That's really hurting the US and its allies in the region. Russian narratives are also being boosted by the Chinese about Ukraine. Another huge narrative change is that China is now selling a development model. Under Hu Jintao, they certainly did not do that. Now they have the confidence to sell everything from the way they do poverty alleviation to the way they do media, even the way they do the rule of law, which I never thought I'd see. So what to do? There's all this variance. What is the US going to do? Are they going to make Guam a state? Are they going to pull back to Hawaii? people need to know fairly soon what's going on. As always, best policy, work to your strengths. In the Pacific, your strengths are the social media companies. Facebook is still seen as a US company in the Pacific, probably not in the rest of the world, but there it has tremendous capacity to do good. It's not doing all that much good at the moment, but it really could have a big influence. Chinese actors I talk to are really concerned about the tech companies being let off the loose. They see Google building cables. They see Elon Musk advising the president. They had their own moment with Jack Ma, and they're running, what on earth is the US doing? And it's really got them on edge. Other strengths, the US has Pacific communities. China does not. So treat those communities well, not just as sources for the US military, but genuinely treat them well. Don't, deport them willy-nilly, and really cultivate them. Cuts to the Voice of America and Radio Free Asia are affecting all kinds of organizations that are significant in the Pacific, OCCRP, Benar News, and even a company like Wainao, a sort of a Chinese magazine that was funded by RFA, now cut, an incredible blow to the US position amongst the Chinese diaspora and amongst even the Chinese community in America. Don't go for shortcuts. Don't do these influence operations. You'll get found out. I know not everyone's for them, but they just don't work in the Pacific. Pacific is too small. Work with church groups. Everyone from the Seventh-day Adventists to the Latter-day Saints are there, and you can certainly work through those. And that would be bipartisan. I'm at my 7 minutes, so I'll leave you there.
Thank you so much. Thank you all, actually, so much. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair and ask the first question to all of you. With the concept of friends to all, enemies to none, what, in your estimation, would the countries of the region want that to look like? How would that best work for them? What are they aiming for? Yes, Dr.
I can start. I think it's a complex question, because I think increasingly policymakers in the region, I think, appreciate the fact that while ideally they don't want to make choices between the United States and China, and it's a much more sort of multipolar landscape, there are going to be certain sectors where they do have to make choices. We've already seen that with telecommunications. We're seeing that with artificial intelligence. And that's why I mentioned in my testimony that I think there might need to be some reframing of how we think about competition. So perhaps in the full spectrum competition sense, you can sort of envision this as being no zero-sum choices, but there are going to be certain industries where ecosystems need to be constructed where countries are going to have to make choices. And I actually think a good example of this is Vietnam, for example, on semiconductors. They've actually been socializing this idea of thinking about technology more as an ecosystem rather than as a transactional approach of something you buy off the shelf from one country and then another country. And so I think that's one way of approaching it. But I do agree that in some of the other countries, there is a tendency to say, we don't want to make certain choices across all of these realms. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question, Commissioner Price. I think when countries say they do not want to be forced to choose, they would prefer not having to choose across issues and in general on alignment, so whether to align with the United States or China. Increasingly, they are accepting that even though they don't like it, that they might have to choose on specific issues, whether it's about banning Huawei and 5G infrastructure or restricting Chinese access to semiconductors or excluding Chinese firms from undersea cable networks. That said, they want that to be limited perhaps to specific issues as opposed to the United States requiring a general alignment on the United States versus China. However, I think what is fair, which hasn't happened very much, is for the United States to expect Southeast Asia to make a clear choice on being for international law and not just saying that. So for instance, Southeast Asia cannot fairly be expected to choose between the United States and China, given what both countries bring to the table. But they should be expected to align clearly with principles of international law. So in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most countries stood with the United States and other Western powers that condemned the invasion. However, I think stronger action needs to be taken by countries who say that international law is important to them, and it is.
Thank you. Dr. Smith?
Thank you. This is a great question. I'll add two dimensions to that. One is that it can often be a transactional thing on the Pacific side. So not having to choose also means if you choose to not provide something, then we can go to China and they will provide it. So this often leads to a slightly reactive approach to policy making here in Australia and elsewhere. The other side to it is if you're going to ask us to choose, make sure you're giving us a meaningful choice. And particularly in the area of investment, you hear this throughout the Pacific, it's like you're telling us not to take Chinese investment. Okay, where's the American investment? Be it in Guam on tourism. If you're in Fiji, the power of China is not debt trap diplomacy. That's got a lot of play. But the real power of China in the region is the pipeline of investment, the promise of if we go with China, Fiji is lacking 5,000 hotel beds. Who's going to build those hotels? They're betting that China's going to build a fair chunk of them. So if you are going to push for a choice, make sure it's a choice that's meaningful to Pacific Island countries, because at the moment, they just don't see it. Beyond military engagement, they're wanting more on the trade and investment side, and they're just not seeing it from the US.
Thank you. My time is up. Co-chair?
Thank you. This idea of not wanting to choose, it never particularly bothered me as long as countries are willing to choose their own sovereignty, choose rule of law, choose to make decisions from capital without undue pressure or coercion, excuse me. That generally aligns with us. So I think your point, Dr. Kuok, about putting those arguments forward about international law, rules, norms, et cetera, is a very important one. I want to ask a question, maybe of all three, about China's perceptions of the current trajectory in the region. How do they judge in Beijing whether they are winning, gaining, succeeding? What is their criteria? And do they feel as though they've got the wind at their back right now, given whatever you might want to cite, given our own policy decisions here in Washington, given the success of their diplomacy and investment? But I'm curious how you think the Chinese view the current trajectory and what is the important criteria for them in this competition? We can just go down the line again.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, at least publicly, China tends to evaluate its capabilities more sort of in a comprehensive basis, so comprehensive national power. And when they refer to this in public engagements with ASEAN or individual Southeast Asian countries, they tend to point to the breadth of their engagement and not focus as much on the depth of their engagement, because they know that they have an advantage, perceived advantage over the United States in certain channels of communication. So that's kind of the general line that I see. I also do see that China has been talking a lot more publicly about its non-economic levers of influence over the past few years. I think perhaps a decade or two ago, Lynn mentioned this in her testimony as well. China being a leading trade partner is frankly quite an old story. It's kind of a story of the 2000s. Right now, China is very, very bold and public in terms of talking about engage more on the global security initiative. We want to talk to you about dual-use facilities. And this is not something that's sort of secret or something that you have to parse statements through. They're saying this publicly across to all of the Southeast Asian states. So the strategy that people talked about hypothetically maybe about 2 decades ago, that China, like every power we've known in history, is going to initially start with economic levers of influence and then move to the security domain and have comprehensive levers of influence. Well, I see that very much happening in Southeast Asia. And so when we talk about things like the Ream Naval Base in Cambodia, I think that's just one sign of something that's going to become more regular across the region. I mean, they're talking about minilateral exercises, more patrols, going across all of these Southeast Asian countries and saying, look at how much we're giving you economically. Why are you not doing more with us in the security domain? You can do something with the United States, but you need to do more with us across all of these domains. So I think that's kind of how I see it more generally.
Thank you very much for your important question. How does China see recent developments and where it stands? I think if I were China, I would be looking on quite cheerfully at what's happening. First, I mentioned how the Gaza issue was impacting the region. We do not see a change in that, and we in fact see a doubling down. Second, you mentioned earlier that the United States doesn't expect countries to choose, and I think that has been the case in terms of general alignment for a long time. However, there are signs, say for instance, the United States approach to Panama, where Panama was asked to reduce Chinese influence and control, and that was a news catching report. But there are also smaller developments since, where, say, well, not smaller, but there also have been developments since, say, the national security presidential memo issued, I believe it was in February, where the United States is fast-tracking investments for allies and partners if allies and partners do not invest in adversaries. So I think there are indications where the United States might be forcing a harder choice. Third, I think China would be watching how the United States is behaving with respect to its allies and partner in Europe with some glee. I think it's been quite quiet publicly, but behind closed doors, it's pointing out to ASEAN and its member states that the United States could similarly be lacking in its commitment to Southeast Asian countries. Fourth, I think if we're looking at the U.S. activities in terms of trade, in the trade realm, the imposition of tariffs or the threats of tariffs on allies and partners, I think that would be concerning countries in the region, many of whom have either a significant or major trade surpluses with the United States. And so it's not only about economic implications of those tariffs, but if countries are worried about how the United States might retaliate against them in terms of their trade surpluses with the United States, how willing would these countries then be willing to support positions that are in the U.S. interests? And
I'm sorry, Dr. Kuok, I'm over time. Can we get
sure.
a quick answer from Dr. Smith, please?
Yeah, very brief take. They'd be very happy with their progress in two countries in particular, in the Solomon Islands and Kiribati, where they've got some regimes that are, to a certain extent, have internalized China's own development narratives. I think it's also important, though, there's a distinction between Southeast Asia and the Pacific. China has a very strong historical engagement. The Chinese regime has a strong historical engagement with Southeast Asia. It doesn't have any presence in the Pacific before the 1970s, and even then it wasn't until the 2000s. So they're a fair way behind in terms of their, the consciousness, if you like, within the Chinese system of the Pacific, and also the public. There was a memorable moment when Nauru switched to Taiwan after the Taiwanese election to sort of punish the DPP for being re-elected. And the reaction on the Chinese internet was very much, are we seriously going to get excited about winning over the third smallest country in the world? No, we're not.
Thank you. Just for the record, all three have cited things are moving in a positive direction for China at the moment. So,
thank you. Commissioner Brands.
Thank you. So this question is for Dr. Parameswaran. You mentioned in your testimony that Beijing perceives a window of opportunity to expand its influence in the region. Could you just say a bit more about that and why that window is open, what its implications might be?
Yeah, I think since late last year, Chinese interlocutors have been talking about this idea that if we saw a second Trump administration, they sense for their own interests that there might be a perceived window of opportunity for China, not just in Southeast Asia, but also the broader global South. So they have been parading across the region, talking about things like, if there is potential US tariffs, we have a zero tariff policy across some of these Southeast Asian countries. They've tried to apply this to a lot of the lesser developed countries proactively. I think they also see a window on trade because China is going to be the chair of APEC next year in 2026. And so I think they see an open runway for them to engage in this domain. I also do think that China senses that a lot of the reprioritization that we're seeing on international aid and media engagement gives them another window of opportunity there. But I would just offer a cautionary note that China's inroads in Southeast Asia is a more than 3-decade story. And it's filled with perceived windows of opportunity that China has repeatedly not been able to capitalize on. And a lot of that is a consistent trend. China is the most, Lynn mentioned in her testimony, and Graham talked about it as well, consistently across the region, China is seen as the most influential power, but the most distrusted power. And the question for the region is, does China care? And I'm not sure they do. So it's important to look at these polls, but it's also important to recognize that there's a lot of rhetoric to China's sort of window of opportunity, but a lot of that is not repeatable across the domain. So on international assistance, for example, the US and China differ almost in the opposite. So the US offers about 85% of its assistance through aid versus loans. China does almost the exact opposite. So the idea that China is going to fill some void on international development assistance, I think, is quite overstated.
You also mentioned the issue of maritime domain awareness and how the US has traditionally pursued sort of a Philippines-centric strategy on this. Could you just say a little bit more about the importance of that issue in general, and then where you think there may be opportunities to go beyond the existing paradigm in the U.S. approach to this issue?
Yeah, so I think this is an important question because I think to us here in the United States, the Philippines often apply. It's a treaty ally, it's a long-standing U.S. Partner, and so it's very easy to work with the Philippines. I mean, they have a lot of military ties with us and so on and so forth. But within parts of the region, the Philippines is seen as more of an exception rather than a norm in that regard. And it's also really important for us to recall that within the sort of intra-regional balance of power, when on issues like the South China Sea, you need to keep the Philippines on side, but you also need Vietnam, you need Malaysia, you need Brunei, you need Indonesia. And so it's important to address all of these countries so that these countries can also get along with each other, right? I mentioned ASEAN in my testimony, and the reason why I mention it is because, yes, on big geopolitical issues, ASEAN moves very slowly. But the whole purpose of ASEAN in the first place was to make sure that they contain these intra-regional tensions within the region. And so US policy should keep that in mind. I mean, one regional interlocutor mentioned this as sort of he was making a football or soccer analogy, and he said, US policy sometimes is so narrow that it's perceived it has a PSV problem, which is we engage a lot with the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. But beyond that, the engagement starts getting a little bit sketchy. And I think Lynn mentioned this in her testimony as well. So I think it's not only important just as kind of an optics conversation, but the intra-regional balance of power is very important in terms of how we plan our Southeast Asia strategy.
And then finally, just in the limited time we have left, you mentioned a potential Chinese push for additional basing or access opportunities. Could you just talk a little bit about what the implications of that might be?
Yeah, I think, Cambodia, as I mentioned, is one of those examples that we think about. It's in the headlines a lot. But actually, in terms of the actual strategic presence and utility, it's actually quite limited, given its location in the Gulf of Thailand. There are other scenarios that policymakers have been thinking about. For example, East Timor or Timor-Leste is right near sort of certain areas where you're able to run submarines through. And that actually, if this kind of proceeds in that direction, and I'm not suggesting that it necessarily may, but it's something that's not only a challenge for the United States, it's a challenge for Australia, It's a challenge for Indonesia, and it's a challenge for a lot of partner countries in the region. So, that's one area to watch. The other one that I would mention as well is China is talking about not just military facilities, but also dual-use facilities, including ports, as locations for this. There were a number of instances where they were trying to make inroads, including in Malaysia, for example. Some of that has not taken off as much as they would like, but you could easily see what is happening in mainland Southeast Asia, where we usually see the initial indications of where China is advancing, move to maritime Southeast Asia, where the US actually has had a very significant strategic advantage. And if we see that, that is a big cautionary call for the United States.
Thank you very much.
Commissioner Friedberg.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of our witnesses for your statements. I'd like to ask each of you to respond to this question. We talk a lot about winning and losing, increasing American influence, decreasing American influence, and so on. If you had to explain it as our bosses, if you like, the members of Congress whom we serve, have to answer questions from their constituents. If you had to help them answer the following questions, how would you do it? What exactly does it mean for the United States to lose influence, or for China to gain influence, or for one or the other to win or lose in this part of the world? And even more important, why exactly does it matter? Why should the constituents of members of Congress care about that? Maybe we could start with you, Mr. Parameswaran.
Yeah, so if I were to just put it in one or two sentences, I would say if China were to gain control and create a geoeconomic sphere of influence in the center of the world's most prosperous region, which is the Indo-Pacific, that would make everyday Americans poorer, that would make everyday Americans less secure, and that would also make everyday Americans also more isolated from that sort of hub of growth and opportunity. And so that would be a clear sort of issue or challenge for U.S. interests. But I also think, more importantly, imagine any region of the world, and now imagine the most dynamic of the region of the world looking more like China than it does the United States, or for that matter, forget the United States, Australia, Japan, any of allies and partners. That is a scary thought to imagine when you think about not just security and economics, but also democracy, human rights, media freedom, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Kuok.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just very quickly, I wanted to respond to the point of China's, there being a great deal of mistrust on China, and there is, but notwithstanding that high degree of mistrust, which was recorded in the poll last year as well, China still came out on top of the United States in the choice of alignment partners. So in response to your points, Commissioner Friedberg, I think what Prashant highlighted is an important point, namely that if China were to control the Indo-Pacific or the South China Sea or Southeast Asia, we could see trade routes potentially being closed off. In the past, that was hard to imagine, because in the past, that would be cutting off its own nose to spite its face, given the high levels of interconnectedness between China and the rest of the world, including the United States. But now with decoupling, it's not that hard to imagine as well. Now with decoupling as well as deteriorating relations, it's not that hard to imagine. And second, if the United States military does its job in terms of deterring conflict in the region, a military conflict in the region, and I think it will, then what the United States and China is competing for is influence in the region. And so in terms of all measures short of war, where does the United States stand vis-a-vis China? And I think influence is that battleground. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Smith.
You're muted.
You're muted. Still can't hear you.
someone has to do that every time on a web thing. So, look, notwithstanding, I disagree with the whole losing the Pacific thing. If you were to pitch it to your congressman, I would say to make it an issue of transnational crime. If the US leaves the region and draws back to Hawaii and Chinese transnational crime networks, which are not purely Chinese, but they're big players in money laundering, human trafficking and drugs. The Pacific used to just be a place where the drugs passed across. It's now shifting to a region where the drugs are actually produced and shipped to Australia and the US. So purely from a self-interest point of view, if you want a stable region that is not shipping drugs into America, then you need to do something to dissuade China from becoming the dominant force in the region. And this also applies to other forms of crime. Online scams are far more prominent in Southeast Asia than the Pacific, but there are signs of scam centers. And it is more profitable to target the US than it is to China because of the way China sets up its social media companies. So yeah, I'd go with fear.
Commissioner Goodwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to follow up on Commissioner Freeberg's question because I suspect the impact of losing influence and losing competition in these regions may be broader than what we just heard. So I want to return to the question of what the loss of influence in those regions means for our ability to engage in other regions around the world and on other issues, including Middle East policy, the war in Ukraine, and the like. And I'll open it up to the panel.
Like to start?
So I guess part of the question was on how does this affect U.S. engagement with other regions of the world, I think, right? Including the Middle East,
yeah,
Europe.
Sure. So if China's growing influence in these regions, obviously affects our ability to engage strategically in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific Islands. If we lose that influence in those regions, how does it further hinder our ability to engage in other regions and on other issues?
Right, and I think that's a sort of essence of a very pertinent question in the region, because I think the perception, and it could be right or it could be wrong, that you often hear when you're in the region, and I think Lynn kind of referenced this in her testimony as well, is that the era of the pivot to Asia that we heard, so now almost 2 decades ago, where Asia would be prioritized and there was the pivot within the pivot where Southeast Asia was going to be prioritized within that, is over, right? That now the focus is on a global competition with China, and each of the sub-regions is going to get less and less attention. The competition is going to be fiercer, and at the same time, the United States is engaged in 2 wars and the resolution of 2 conflicts that are outside the Indo-Pacific theater. So this idea that we can only focus on Asia and we're going to prioritize Southeast Asia within that, I sense, talking to policymakers, a lot more uncertainty about what that means. And that has fundamental implications. We talk a lot about U.S. commitment in the aggregate, but that's derivative of not just how we talk about power and confront threats, but it also has to do with how we resource our priorities. And with each administration coming in and promising a lot of these initiatives, you sense a little bit of commitment fatigue in the region. I think I spoke to one official who sort of called this quote unquote commitment bombing, right? So every time China is coming in and offering something, the United States feels compelled and other countries feel compelled to say, no, here's an alternative. But the question for these countries is, in 5 or 10 years, what is the actual deliverables that they're getting for these resources? So they see a lot of commitments being put up as this resourcing challenge across theaters happens. But actually, the sort of deliverables that confront these countries and what they're getting out of it is a lot less certain. And so I do think that affects our credibility to engage.
I'm sorry to interrupt. That kind of touches on another question I have, which is what are the risks to the United States of viewing and approaching these regions primarily, if not exclusively, as for competition with China?
I'm happy to answer that one, if that's okay. Sure. That is really the key question for people in the Pacific. Pacific is not poorly governed, but it's very much stretched. So it's small populations, and they're engaging with a huge number of donors and partners. And so the commitment fatigue he was talking about there really stretches in the Pacific. Now, where it's a problem is the question of why are you coming to us is a really key question. If you're only coming to talk to us because China came here last week, as we often see, then your credibility is reduced. There was a fascinating study done of Solomon Islands' social media reaction to this security agreement that was signed with China. And it actually ran negative for the US because straight after it was signed, a bunch of US officials flew in. And rather than seeing this as, what business does China have signing this, draconian security agreement with our government? Yes, it didn't poll well for the Solomon Islands government, but it polled even more negatively for the US, where people were kind of like, hang on, you've ignored us for, since World War II, suddenly you're flying in every second week. It's just seen as if you're only here because of China, then, we're not impressed.
I think, as you point out, Commissioner, the impact on the United States of a declining influence in Southeast Asia is broader, and engaging Southeast Asia through the lens of US-China competition is not ideal. Let me point out the number of ways in which it has a broader impact on the near region as well as beyond. In the latest meeting between Xi Jinping and the president of Indonesia, the two leaders signed a joint statement. And in that joint statement, Indonesia not only agreed to joint cooperation in the South China Sea with China, so possibly conceding that there are overlapping claims between China and Indonesia, but Indonesia went further in other parts of its statement to also cite language or use language very much in favor of China on Taiwan. So that was an issue. So impacting more than just Southeast Asia. Second, on the Middle East, I think it'll be very hard to get Southeast Asian countries' alignment on the Middle East with the United States. Nonetheless, I think it's important not to have the region think about the United States as a power with double standards and allowing of great atrocities in the region, but one that is constructively trying to handle the situation. And finally, of course, it hurts its position in Ukraine and broader Europe because this is part of the sort of anti-global North sentiment that's coming from the global South. Let me close there because I know we're out of time.
Could I just add something really quick? Yeah, go ahead. So I just wanted to go back to something Graham said, because I think it's a really important point, which is, countries don't want to make choices, but they do want more options and alternatives. And I think the U.S. is in a position to provide that, not necessarily a like for like necessarily, but there are plenty of examples where the United States has stepped in to do this, right? There was a bankrupt shipyard in Subic Bay in the Philippines, and the United States stepped in to prevent that from happening and China acquiring it, right? In Myanmar, there was this giant port project that China was sort of involved in, and the United States supported capacity building, not for an actual port project, but for the government of Myanmar, the previous government of Myanmar, to evaluate that and then shrink it so that it wouldn't get into a huge debt burden. So these don't get a lot of headlines, but I just want to point out
for the law of the sea and where you think we should go from here?
Absolutely. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is the second most universally respected piece of international legislation ever negotiated after the UN Charter itself. And even the US government, for the last 40 years, has maintained that the treaty is effectively the law of the land. The G7 statement on maritime security just last week, the U.S. Secretary of State said that the U.S. recognizes the maritime order underpinned by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So the fact that we still have not ratified and become a formal party of this treaty that the U.S. helped negotiate for more than a decade, it doesn't gain the United States anything. The United States increasingly bears all the responsibilities of membership in UNCLOS because we treat it as customary law, but we miss out on a great many of the potential benefits. We are not a party to the International Seabed Authority. While we complain about potential Chinese monopolization of deep seabed mining, we had a guaranteed veto in the ISA if we had taken it up and chose not to. We cannot formally submit our extended continental shelf for the UN Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and therefore you're not going to get any commercial entity who's going to feel the certitude to invest in any exploration beyond 200 nautical miles, whether in the Pacific or the Arctic. So I no longer see any substantive benefits the U.S. gets by staying outside. What I do see is that we give China a pass in every argument to say, who are you to complain about our violating the law when you won't even sign up to it? It's a self-own that no longer makes much sense for the U.S. national interest.
Thank you. Let me switch to Mr. Tower for a moment here. The transnational crime is something that we are starting to pay a little bit more attention to as a commission, but we're also in a world where crypto, particularly in the United States, is becoming more high profile. We may have a strategic Bitcoin reserve. We're certainly having a different regulatory scheme be considered for crypto regulation. What are the new or growing challenges that we should be keeping an eye on in terms of the proliferation of cryptocurrencies, in terms of China policy, in terms of Chinese transnational crime and their place in the region?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the online scamming that's now increasingly targeting the U.S., it really is leveraging, taking the advantage of the fact that many people in the U.S., many people in other countries don't have very high levels of literacy when it comes to these newer forms of financial products or of cryptocurrency or of blockchain or of fintech more broadly. So I think that's the first thing, sort of increasing literacy in this space is important. A second thing that they're taking advantage of is these scams, once they've managed to get the currency into a crypto wallet, they're then using these massive networks of crypto mules to move the crypto across very wide spread wallets. It may go pass through hundreds of wallets before it's consolidated somewhere and comes out. And they're doing this so quickly that it makes it extremely difficult for law enforcement, whether that's in the US, whether that's in a country like Singapore, but it makes it very difficult for law enforcement to trace the money, to track where the crypto is going, and then to look at where it actually comes out in the actual financial market somewhere. So that's, I think, another challenge that the criminal actors are exploiting, is that generally the capacity of law enforcement, and that's really across the board, across the world, to investigate crimes in cryptocurrency is a lot lower. And you hear in many countries, I mean, these very common lines of law enforcement just simply not dealing in cryptocurrency at all. And then I think another problem when it comes to regulation is that you have now just a real proliferation of all of these different fintech platforms that will enable transfers of a full range of cryptocurrencies into fiat currencies, but really without much collection of information about who the customers are, who's on the other side of the wallets. And so this is also another problem, that you have so many of these unregulated fintech products that it's actually making it quite easy for criminal actors to launder the cryptocurrency once it's been stolen in these scams. So again, maybe by increasing regulation, pushing other countries around the world to increase their regulation of these different types of financial technologies and some of these different different fintech exchanges that could help to address some of these different problems.
Thank you.
Commissioner Kuiken.
Mr. Tower, I was reading your testimony and I was reminiscing in my mind about the time I actually landed the words "cash is king" in one of the National Defense Authorization Acts. It was wonderful to see somebody talk about transnational crime. We had a recommendation last year about consumer product safety and counterfeits. And as I was listening to you today talking about transnational crime, I was thinking whether it's fentanyl, the scams you talk about, or counterfeits of like really everything from over-the-counter drugs to prescription drugs to swimming pool drains to anything else you can imagine. It seems like China's incredible manufacturing capacity just allows it to basically deploy counterfeits at will, whether it's through sort of traditional avenues of trade or illegitimate ones where they may or may not use transnational criminal organizations. I think everything you just said to my treasured colleague, Commissioner Miller, is totally right on. As I looked at this problem when I was on the Armed Services Committee, and trying to think about sort of the interagency in the United States government, I sort of never could put my finger on sort of one thing the government could do to sort of get after this problem. If you sort of had I have a colleague who always asks me if I wished one thing could be true, what would it be true? If you had one thing you could get the government to do, or this commission can make a recommendation and sort of urge action on it, what would it be?
For the scams or for counterfeits?
Transnational crime broadly, right? I think there's obviously things that are unique to each of them. There's also things where there's an incredible amount of overlap.
Yeah, I mean, on transnational crime broadly, I think one thing that would be really important to do, I mean, we know who a lot of these bad actors are, and we know who a lot of the states that are providing protection to these criminal actors are. I mean, I think using more effectively sanctions on both the criminal actors and the different state actors that are harboring them, that are giving protection to them, would be one quite effective tool. And just to give an example of this, I mean, right now down in the Thailand-Myanmar border area, you have a militia group that's directly under the Myanmar military that basically hosts tens of thousands of these Chinese scammers, as well as scammers from all over the world, a lot of these individuals being in enforced criminality. We know precisely who that person is. Right now, the Thais are actually working on trying to execute an arrest warrant and to maybe go after this person, but they're struggling with it a bit. And I mean, I think that this is kind of a clear-cut scenario where we could go out and put sanctions on these sorts of individuals, which I think would send a pretty strong message of, the intent to hold them accountable. So I think that's one thing. Then when it comes to some of the more, I guess, sort of specific crime trends, like, for example, what we're seeing with the online scams, I think one quite effective approach would be simply to mobilize the private sector in the U.S. to basically increase the cost of perpetrating those forms of crimes that impact Americans, right? I mean, if it was much more difficult for the criminals behind these scams to identify people using social media, using dating applications, for example, a lot of these scams would go away. I mean, you wouldn't see the criminals even getting access to Americans. So using AI more effectively to weed some of this stuff out, I think would be a way of doing it. But really, again, I mean, incentivizing the private sector to take more steps to address some of these problems would be a second, I think, measure.
Thank you, Mr. Tower. I'll give this question to both witnesses that are here. So as I've been listening to you sort of respond to questions in your opening testimony, the sort of takeaway I have in my mind is that basically China has a total disregard for traditional norms and standards in the global commons. So whether it's the South China Sea, Taiwan, you guys have gone through the sort of list of things. And they basically established a new normal. This is sort of how I've thought about this. And so if we're going to sort of put this back in the box, what's the first thing we should do? What is I said to Mr. Tower one thing, he gave me two. What is the one thing, in the interest of time, you would want the United States government to do, or that you'd want this commission to recommend to Congress to compel the executive branch to do, to the extent we can do that anymore?
Okay, there we go. Yeah, raise the cost of taking Chinese money in the target countries. So what the U.S. did recently with designating the Thais who sent the Uyghurs back to China, that makes a big difference. So make the Chinese illegal activity unwelcome in the target countries. Make people know they're not going to get a visa to the U.S., their bank accounts and assets in the West might be seized, that, there is a cost. So you can go, the Chinese will just send new people. Broken Tooth was operating in Palau. He was attempting to get land, we've heard, near where the U.S. is putting in a military installation. I mean, these are, the nexus between transnational organized crime and strategic concerns is very tight. They will use the organized crime for strategic gains. So make them unwelcome. You used to know, don't do business with the Soviets. Right? They're the bad guys. It's going to be a problem for you when you're dealing with the U.S. Make it similarly a problem, and this is even easier because this is illegal anyway.
Quoted would suggest. We do better, but the most important thing is to first do no harm, right? Things like disbanding RFA, which has huge benefits compared to the meager cost it is only damaging the United States. Dismantling USAID, at least in the chaotic way it's been done, is hugely damaging. The United States, if it just maintains the presence it already has, is extremely competitive in the region. And we are our own biggest danger, not China.
Okay, Commissioner Goodwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my appreciation to the panel for their great testimony today. Mr. Tao, I was interested to see the parallels you touched on in your testimony about combating fentanyl and the fentanyl crisis with combating these criminal scams across these regions. And in that context, you touched on the value of cooperation and coordination between law enforcement agencies in China and the United States, including sharing intelligence, obviously holding individual officials responsible, and engaging and ensuring that any domestic crackdown doesn't simply shift a focus, an emphasis, and operations elsewhere, including especially towards the United States. The challenge is, as it has been in the fentanyl efforts, how best to incentivize that sort of cooperation and coordination. And if we can't, and if they won't, how do we impose costs?
I think one way of addressing this is also considering that where are the scam centers? Where is a lot of this activity taking place? It's on Thailand's border. There's also scam centers in the Philippines. And in all of the different crackdowns and raids, you're seeing where lots of devices are being seized and taken out of Myanmar, going into Thailand. Right now, what is happening, actually, I think it's really frustrating for the Thais, because Thailand is trying to be involved in a crackdown. It's trying to do some of this work down there, but China's coming in and it's really kind of pushing the Thais around a little bit. China wants access to all of those phones. It wants access to all that data. And basically what you've seen happen over the past month since this crackdown has started down on the Thai-Myanmar border is that China's almost gotten almost all of those devices. That includes, computers, cell phones, everything else that has massive amounts of data on it related to all of the different scam victims around the world that these scam syndicates have been perpetrating crimes on. Now, if the U.S. was kind of down in there and working much, much more closely with Thailand on this crackdown, I think the U.S. could then be accessing those devices, could then be supporting the Thais in those negotiations over who actually gets access to that information. And then I think there's another space where this could also happen that could help us really kind of get a leg up and a better understanding of how these things work is in the Philippines, where there's a lot of political will. And unlike in other countries in the region where, the scam centers are in Myanmar, Laos, or Cambodia, it's generally going to be the case. It's going to be a lot harder for the U.S. to work in those countries. And you're often seeing where China's leading the crackdown and so is going to get access to all that intelligence. In the case of the Philippines, they're cracking down really on their own, right? I mean, and they don't want China involved with it. And in fact, around some of their crackdowns, they've seized lots of devices. They just don't simply have the capacity, the technology to crack those devices open and to build out, some of the analysis of that data. So I think that that's another avenue where, the U.S. could kind of get ahead of the game a little bit in terms of actually working with other countries where, the criminal activity is happening, where these Chinese crime syndicates are operating. We could get access to some of that information that way. And then I think as the U.S. starts to build up more of a better understanding of how this works, it starts to build more of a database of losses to victims and starts making more of those connections, then it will be on better ground to go and really push the Chinese to start, giving over more of that data and more of that intelligence. I mean, there are other ways of getting access to the intelligence that we need to crack down on these crimes other than just, asking China for it.
Thank you. Ms. Pascal, I wanted to follow up on the questions that Commissioner Stivers posed to you about your recommendation number 24 about extending these COFA agreements to additional countries. Previously in your written testimony, you also seemed to suggest that the structure of these existing COFAs were perhaps a bit outdated in the sense that they were built upon the assumption that the greatest danger in the region would be hostile military action. How do we structure and craft these new agreements, as you would recommend, in a way that best confronts the threat of Chinese influence?
Thank you very much. That's a core point. So the COFAs have the ability to help the countries develop capacities in investigation and prosecution that can be supplemented in other ways, for example, information sharing and things like that. One of the things that has been very helpful in Palau has been the setting up of a national security coordinator position that helps coordinate intelligence sharing and investigations with a range of allied partners. And that's been started now in the Marshall Islands. They are desperately understaffed. COFA funding can be used for training and facilitation for expansion of those facilities. And I would just quickly, the whole framing we've had is U.S. versus China, and that's very much of a Chinese narrative. And what's clear in a lot of the compact states is especially because two of them recognize Taiwan. It's those who want a free and open Indo-Pacific, as has been conceived from Washington for about 150 years, functionally, at least in the Pacific, versus those who want to close it down. And when you look at it that way, you can bring in a whole bunch of different countries, including, India on healthcare, Japan on microeconomic development. Taiwan has been helping Palau go through the Chinese language technology that's been seized by the Chinese organized crime groups. And they can be worked into the development of COFA structures that go after the ICAD activity and broaden out the narrative from this just being a U.S. versus China thing. So the shift from to the sort of things that actually create social resilience. The tools are there within, the tools and the money are there within the compacts. That money is mandated. But the way that it's delivered can be more responsive to those specific threats.
With the indulgence of the chair, just one quick follow-up. Commissioner Stivers also explored this issue about the level of support in these countries for your recommendation. But specifically, my understanding of the existing compacts is that they were authorized by Congress and then approved by referenda in the individual states. if those votes were held today, how would they turn out in those countries that you recommend we should extend COFAs to?
So bingo. So in the one that would be a big question is the Federated States of Micronesia, and it's an uncomfortable constitutional structure to begin with. And President Panuelo, the just past president, has written very incisive letters that describe Chinese activity within the FSM, within the Federated States of Micronesia, including the supporting of independence movements. And we're starting to see that happening. YAP, where the U.S. is putting in a major airfield, recently had a referenda to vote on reevaluating its constitutional relationship with FSM as a whole, which would, of course, involve reevaluating the compacts, the COFA. So this sort of entropic warfare, or what the Chinese call disintegration warfare, of trying to break apart a country from the inside, is very apparent. I would highly recommend reading the letters from President Panuelo. They describe in great detail what's been going on in his country. And I think part of the goal for that is to create such internal fragmentation and competition that the compacts can break apart. And also the funding for the FSM compacts is different than in Marshall Islands, structured different than Marshall Islands and Palau. And I personally think there's a case to be made that they have deliberately structured it to be in a position to walk away from the compacts, if not in 20 years, then sooner.
Thank you.
Commissioner Friedberg.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Poling, you suggest that China's policies in the South China Sea are primarily about national myth-making and political legitimacy. I want to explore with you the hypothesis that may understate the nature of China's ambitions. That, in fact, perhaps their goal has been for some time, maybe 20 years, maybe more, essentially to do what it appears they are trying to do, which is to get into a position where they can enforce their claims, territorial and maritime claims, and where ultimately they can exert effective control over the waters, airspace, resources of this vast area, and that they've made real progress towards that over the last 20 years. And so just looking at the symbolic significance may understate, if we take a longer view, what it is that they're after. Could you respond to that?
Apologies. I don't disagree. The argument I would make, though, is the reason that China has wanted to exert control over the resources, the trade, the military activity in the South China Sea is not because of those things in and of themselves. The resources are relatively meaningless. All the oil known to exist in the South China Sea accounts for less than 2 years of daily consumption in China. The impact of trade diversion has been vastly overstated. I have no doubt that the PLAN really wants to use the South China Sea, the submarine bastion, and to exclude U.S. forces, but that's not the underlying reason for the claim. Because if that was the only desire, then China could have very easily shattered the U.S.-Philippine alliance at any point during the previous Duterte administration by just playing a little nicer with the Philippines. The totality of China's claims only makes sense in my mind, in a framing based on nationalism. That doesn't change the behavior. It doesn't change China's aims or the threat they represent to us, but I think it helps give us clarity on what we can expect China to actually be willing to compromise on. There is no bilateral military modus vivendi the U.S. and China can reach that would solve the South China Sea, and there's no amount of economic cooperation the Southeast Asians could offer that would do the same.
Let me suggest an alternative hypothesis to that part of your argument. Maybe China hasn't negotiated and agreed to a reduction in the scope of its claims in the South China Sea in return for a reduction in the American presence, because they think in the long run they can have both, and that's what they're aiming for.
I think that is probably accurate. I think if China, I think certainly under Xi Jinping, the two move in tandem. And I don't think there's any hope under Xi's leadership of a compromise. Even if the U.S. did say it was going to stop close-in surveillance and FONOPS, et cetera, it wouldn't change anything about China's behavior toward the Philippines. I do think that there is still room for compromise under a future Chinese leader, but it will have to involve both a compromise on the meaning of China's claims, the nature of historic rights, and concessions by the U.S. as well as Southeast Asian claimants.
Okay. You suggest that, in fact, in recent years, the countries of the region have been successful in pushing back against China, and they've sort of found that the Chinese are reluctant to escalate. Here, too, I wonder, though, if this isn't a little bit too narrow a view. And so perhaps the question would be, what exactly might be required? What would change that you think could cause China to be willing to escalate? And let me suggest here also a hypothesis. Maybe it has to do with their assessment of the extent to which the United States is committed to pushing back against possible escalation. And if they come to doubt that, they may be willing to play a lot rougher than they have.
I think that's absolutely correct. Had the United States not persistently clarified the application of the Mutual Defense Treaty to the Philippines over the last several years, I'm quite confident that the BRP Sierra Madre would not be on Second Thomas Shoal, that China would have been willing to escalate to at least a small contained use of military force if necessary. And that probably applies across the South China Sea.
Okay, so this could be a temporary improvement depending on the extent of the American perceived commitment. The last question I wanted to ask you, and it's a big one, so maybe you could just give us a brief response, but what do you think China or this particular CCP regime's desired end state in the South China Sea is?
I don't think that China actually wants all the resources of the South China Sea, but I certainly think that it wants all of its neighbors to have to ask permission before they can tap their own. I think it wants, as it's written into the very first draft of the DOC all the way back in 1998, no foreign military activity without China's permission, no joint exercise without China's permission. This is about an acceptance of Chinese hegemony, not about direct Chinese control of all the activity.
Okay, but that's more than just myth-making, and it's more than just China's legitimacy.
I would argue that that has now become synonymous with the myth-making of historic rights that emerged in the 90s and was solidified under Xi Jinping since 2013.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Brands.
My questions pick up where the last set left off. And so, Mr. Poling, you mentioned in your testimony the concerted Chinese pressure campaign that the Philippines found themselves under, particularly at Second Thomas Shoal, mostly last year, I guess it was, extending perhaps a bit far beyond that. And you mentioned, this, I think if I'm paraphrasing correctly, the mathematical certainty that at some point a Filipino sailor is going to get killed in one of these encounters. And so my question is, what happens then? And so you stated, and I would agree with this, that it would be extremely damaging if the U.S. were to sort of do nothing in response to that. It would also seem that Second Thomas Shoal is a bad place to sort of go all the way. And so what does the suite of appropriate U.S. responses look like to that sort of scenario?
I certainly think that we should avoid the framing of retreat versus sinking a Chinese DDG over some skirmish in the South China Sea. Article 4 does not obligate the United States to go to war with China if China kills a Filipino service member. It requires the United States and the Philippines to jointly take steps to meet the common threat. Those do not have to be kinetic steps. I certainly think that in that case, it will be incumbent on the U.S. to implement hopefully already agreed upon contingency plans that have been in the works under the last, say, 3 years of modernization of the alliance to do things like enhance U.S. presence in the EDCA sites, maybe take steps that the U.S. would have previously considered far too escalatory, like joint patrols in the Spratlys, joint resupply missions, even U.S. boots on the ground in the Spratlys. There's a whole array of issues meant to reestablish deterrence that do not have to involve direct strike on Chinese assets. I would say that every one of those steps is themselves going to be extremely provocative and provoke Chinese countermoves, which is going to put us in precisely the Cold War that so many on both sides say they're trying to avoid.
So you mentioned the expanded EDCA sites, and there has been a significant amount of movement in the U.S.-Philippines alliance over the past few years. And so What do you think are necessary or likely next steps in that alliance? What should a U.S. administration or the Congress be looking toward over the next, say, 5 years in terms of making sure that alliance is fit for purpose?
So when it comes to platforms, I think the most important are going to be intermediate range fires. We already have one set that from the U.S., Tomahawks that have been there since last year. The Filipinos have their own BrahMos missiles. We need more of that on both sides to reestablish some credible risk to Chinese vessels in the South China Sea. Then you need to see real lasting U.S. infrastructure investment in all 9, or at least 7, because 2 of them might not be necessary, of the EDCA sites, because the point eventually is to turn those over to the AFP. They will become Filipino assets. And finally, and one that's been overlooked, is we need to follow through on planned investment in the communities around the EDCA sites. Previously, that was led largely by USAID. Somebody else needs to step into that void because it needs to be clear to Filipino communities that these are a benefit, not a burden, or they will end up the same political football that U.S. basing did in 1992.
Okay. And a final question for you. I think for years, the conventional wisdom has been that China has a very strong presence in the South China Sea in peacetime, but that many of their assets and bases would be extremely vulnerable in war. I take it from what you implied in your testimony that you think that may be shifting as the PLA modernizes and builds out its footprint in the region. So could you just say a little bit more about that?
I actually think that is quite wrong. I published an article in War on the Rocks years ago that provoked an amount of criticism, but I stand by it, that the U.S. could not effectively neutralize Chinese basing in the Spratly Islands and has not been able to for years. In theory, could I run a model that says yes? Sure. But in order to degrade the critical nodes on those islands, you would have to empty the magazine of every vessel in the 7th Fleet. And I struggle to imagine the scenario in which you're willing to do that you're not fighting over Taiwan or some other more significant theater. So I just don't see the world in which the U.S. could actually do that.
Great. Thank you very much.
Would any commissioners like a second round? Yeah. Aaron?
Ms. Pascal, I very much enjoyed your testimony in part because of its historical sweep and the Great White Fleet, Teddy Roosevelt. We don't always get that in testimony, so I really appreciated that historical perspective. But I wanted to go back to a question that one of my colleagues raised earlier to expand on it. What is it exactly that you envision China doing or being able to do if it builds out its position, particularly in the South Pacific Islands? Are you imagining a war in which Marines are going to storm ashore at Guadalcanal, or where China is building bases from which it is going to interdict sea lines of communication running across the Pacific? Play out that scenario a little bit for us.
Sure. We're still kind of mirror imaging our version of war. Right. What you're starting to see, and again, the Pacific Islands are a good place to see where this is going. The headquarters of the Foreign Fisheries Agency, which is the agency that's supposed to counter things like illegal fisheries, is based in Solomon Islands. The Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, is acknowledged by everybody in the region to be doing a good job with a very small number of ships, helping with illegal fisheries. They were supposed to go into port in the Solomons to refuel and sort of check in. And nobody picked up the phone. They couldn't get in. There was bureaucracy. And the islands will use the excuse, oh, you know us, we're all just disorganized and whatever. But the point was they waited around as long as they could. They couldn't come into port. They had to move on to Fiji. And then it happened again in Vanuatu. So you start to see this blocking of U.S. access that's a port example, but you see it in commercial activities. You see it in telecoms. You see it in transport with the direct flights. You're seeing the unrestricted warfare across the board usage of the islands, including for getting into other locations. So in Palau, for example, they published a list of undesirable people, and there were a whole bunch of people from Vanuatu on there. And they were Chinese who had bought Vanuatu passports, right? And they were doing who knows what. And they're using those locations to then launch operations in other places. So it's a much more comprehensive definition of warfare that creates an environment in which the U.S. cannot operate. And it may not know why, and it may be looking in the wrong location, and it's probably fighting in the wrong way. I mean, Senator Rubio passed a law saying that there needed to be a study done and made public into the wealth of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. That would help. That would help as much as sending a Coast Guard vessel into Solomon Islands. We're focused on their U.S. versus China narrative and on fighting in their way, in the way they want us to fight. I would say broaden it out and use the tools that we have. We have truth on our side. How much better can you get? We just need to get that truth out there. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to move, which was the great fear of Roosevelt and McKinley and Reagan. I mean, everybody saw it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you again to our witnesses. Appreciate your support of this commission's work with your expert statements. And we will now break for lunch and reconvene at 1:50. Thank you. Okay, we're going to start. Our third and final panel will examine the impact of China's economic engagement on Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. We'll start with Dr. Vikram Nehru, Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Nehru will testify on the risks presented by China's growing exports to and excess manufacturing capacity in Southeast Asia. Then we'll hear from Dr. Guani Lim, Associate Professor at National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Lim will discuss how multinational corporations from the United States, Japan, and other allies and partners in the region are impacted by Chinese investment in Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, Dr. Alvin Kamba is not available to testify in person today, but his written testimony is available on our website. Thank you both very much for your testimony. I'd like to remind both of our witnesses to please keep your remarks to 7 minutes to preserve time for questions and answers. But Dr. Nehru, will begin with you. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Chair Price, Vice Chair Shriver, and distinguished members of the Commission. Dr. Kuok, Lynn Kuok, this morning in her testimony referred to a survey that I wish to start with. The survey's key conclusion, as she said, was that China remains the dominant economic, political, and strategic force in Southeast Asia, surpassing the United States. China's economic dominance, however, does not translate into popularity. Southeast Asians harbor deep-seated concerns about China. Half of those surveyed distrust China fearing that its growing economic and military power could be leveraged to undermine their sovereignty and national interest. Southeast Asians have greater trust in the United States, but recognize that not only is its economic influence less than China's, but that economic influence is waning while China's is growing, and that its reliability as a partner is also in question. There are two key reasons why China's economic impact in Southeast Asia is so strong. And of course, you know the first one, and that's the fact that Southeast Asia's largest trading partner is China. And those links are in fact deepening as the years go by. And China is also the largest supplier of infrastructure finance to Southeast Asia, eclipsing the contribution of the G7 and the multilateral financial institutions. And the infrastructure that's being built with that finance, ports, road, rail, and now telecom and cloud computing, broadly tie the Southeast Asian economies yet more closely to the Chinese economy. The US, on the other hand, remains by far the largest foreign direct investor in Southeast Asia, and its focus tends to be on Singapore and in services. Indeed, Southeast Asia's trade and services is twice as large with the United States as it is with China. Singapore is Southeast Asia's banker, and US banks, and through them the US financial authorities, wield considerable influence throughout the region. The US dollar remains the currency of choice for all international transactions, irrespective of efforts by Beijing to urge the use of the renminbi. Allow me to highlight just three different aspects of China's influence. Let me start with high tech, and then I'll move on to two other issues which I've been asked to talk on. On the high-tech front, there are three subsectors which are worth considering. The first is the entire electric vehicle or EV manufacturing supply chain, where China dominates the landscape from downstream nickel smelting to batteries to EV manufacturing. Strikingly, US and European companies, including EV producers, have been late in recognizing the potential of Indonesia's reserves in particular, and generally speaking, Southeast Asia. Similarly, the explosive growth of Southeast Asia's digital economy has led to rapid growth in the demand for telecoms infrastructure. Western telecom infrastructure providers had a significant presence in every Southeast Asian country, but now, other than in Singapore, Huawei is the key telecom infrastructure provider offering cheaper technologies with fewer restrictions. Finally, consider cloud computing. Here too, Western companies had a considerable advantage in Southeast Asia a couple of years ago, but with large investments in data centers, Chinese companies have in very short order come to dominate in many Southeast Asian markets. Now let me come to two of the issues which the Commission staff has asked me to focus on. The first is on excess industrial capacity, as the Chair indicated. Trade dependence and the growth of FDI, Chinese FDI, have made Southeast Asian economies vulnerable to the vicissitudes of the Chinese economy. Excess capacity in China is contributing to deflationary price pressures within Southeast Asia and in third country markets where Southeast Asian manufacturers compete with Chinese firms. But having said that, my sense is that the expected tsunami of cheap Chinese goods into Southeast Asia has not yet happened, although policymakers are bracing for this and are actively thinking about policy reactions if that were to occur. The second issue that I've been asked to focus on was on transshipment through Southeast Asian ports. Several Southeast Asian countries, especially Vietnam, but not only Vietnam, have become transshipment points for Chinese-made goods destined for the US to circumvent Section 301 tariffs. Recent analysis shows that at its peak in 2020, the share of such transship products in Vietnam's total exports to the United States was estimated to range between 7.5% and 16%, depending upon the methodology used. but this share has since declined to 4%, or roughly $5 billion, not a particularly large amount, and will probably decline further as Chinese firms relocate to Southeast Asia and Southeast Asian authorities crack down on such transgressors. Finally, my written paper makes 7 policy recommendations designed with one overarching objective: advancing the long-term strategic and economic interests of the United States. They see Southeast Asian economies as partners, not adversaries, and focus on measures that will expand America's economic presence in Southeast Asia, while at the same time making it a trusted and reliable partner whose principles and commitment remain steady and, most importantly, durable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we'll revisit some of those points shortly. Dr. Lin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Hearing co-chairs Commissioner Price, Commissioner Shriver, and distinguished members of the Commission, I am grateful for this opportunity to provide testimony for the Commission's consideration. My statement will primarily focus on the implications of China's economic engagement with Southeast Asia, as I know too little of the Pacific Islands to offer anything useful. Here, in particular, I'd like to discuss 3 themes. The first one, wider economic architecture linking Southeast Asia to the rest of the world. 2, foreign direct investment flows. And 3, the structural issues preventing higher quality growth within the region. After examining these 3 themes, I will conclude with brief recommendations for your kind action. First and foremost, fact is there are very few regions within the global south that have grown as steadily as Southeast Asia since the late 1990s. Its size, about 700 million people, relatively young demography, and generally pro-business attitude present major opportunities for transnational corporations, regardless of country of origin. It should therefore not be surprising that firms like Huawei, BYD, and Lenovo are eyeing the region. The more important question here is, how are transnational corporations from the US and other nations faring in this seemingly intensifying, economic arena? That's a more important question. And there are good news, of course. US firms, they have been leading the way in the region, notwithstanding some alarmist narratives. You see that often in the popular press. US businesses, they consistently out-invest their counterparts from China, Japan, and elsewhere. As the written paper will show, we do not deny the growing influence of China Incorporated. Chinese business groups, they have indeed expanded their market share in the region. That is a fact. Yeah? However, apart from the less developed markets like Cambodia, like Myanmar, they are far from being a dominant force. In key industries, semiconductor and automotive, long-established Western and Japanese firms still set the standard. They still set the standard. However, staying ahead requires more than just pushing foreign direct investment flows, right? The US must strengthen industrial partnerships, invest in workforce development, and ensure Southeast Asia remains an integral part of the global supply chain. By doing so, the US and its allies can not only consolidate its economic presence, but also create a rising tide lifts all boats effect for TNCs, transnational corporations, regardless of nationality, to continue growing the economic pie. That is all I have. Thank you so much.
And then Co-Chair Shriver, and then we'll do in alphabetical. Then we'll do it in alphabetical order from there. I want to go to some of the recommendations, or back to some of the recommendations. Dr. Nehru, you left at the point where you said what the policy recommendations would be about, but can you go into some of the detail? I think you have 7 of them. Is there 1 or 2 that are your top recommendations, and can you talk a little bit about them?
One or 2 top recommendations. Well, let me start by suggesting that rather than the United States trying to emulate China, it should instead focus on areas where it has a commanding comparative advantage. And that is very largely in services and in the areas of high-tech, advanced chips manufacturing, in telecoms, in aerospace, and so forth. It is an interesting point that one of the reasons why services trade in Southeast Asia is relatively small, it's just about 1/5 the size of merchandise trade, is because most Southeast Asian countries, with the honorable exception of Singapore, have very high services trade restrictiveness measures. The STRI, the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, for most Southeast Asian countries, rank them very highly in the world, amongst the highest restrictions. And that seriously erodes the competitive advantage of US service providers. So one area where I believe that the United States can engage seriously with Southeast Asian policymakers is to try and bring down these restrictions, reduce them in ways that US companies then can compete more forcefully, bring their expertise, but also bring their scale economies, which will not only benefit, of course, US companies and the United States, but will benefit Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian services quality is extremely weak. It's in some sense the Achilles heel. Health, education, those sorts of areas are where service providers provide very, very poor quality services and would benefit enormously from expertise, not just from the United States, but also from other countries. So that I would suggest that services is one area where the US could engage Southeast Asian policymakers. The second, I think, that I would mention is the idea of introducing bilateral investment treaties. The idea that investments by US investors, but not just US investors, other investors as well, are subject to protections which are considered standard across the world, but unfortunately are not necessarily enforced in Southeast Asia, and to make sure that those investors have the same advantages as domestic investors, and that any privileges given to them then cannot be ratcheted back by any future legislation. So some kind of bilateral investment treaty that would significantly improve the advantage to US investors, but also investors from elsewhere. I think all 7, frankly, are quite important, but let me just stop after having mentioned those 2.
Okay, and we might get to some of those as well. Dr. Lim, in your recommendations, implications and recommendations, and as you mentioned, you talked about policymakers needing to ensure human capital development is tied to long-term upgrading imperatives, and that U.S. companies are well positioned to lead this effort. What would that look like to you?
would that look like to me? I think at least for me, I think if you observe the news over the last few days, you realize that there was some news revolving around one American chip company, Intel. The new CEO is, I think he's no longer Malaysian, but he was Malaysian-born, and there's an outcome of American engagement over the decades, right? So I think I wouldn't say doing more of the same, but you've got to do the same things while do other things that the previous presenter was saying about. So I think that is one way that this is manifesting itself. A lot of Malaysians were quite happy with the news that, hey, one of us formally eventually became the boss of Intel. So I think that is one way. And I think over a period of a few decades, sometimes engagement has been a bit less, a bit at arm's length. And I think this is a good time to tighten the partnerships, right? Whether through bilateral or multilateral. And one of the things that a lot of Southeast Asians felt somewhat surprised was that the American government was supposed to be part of what we call the CPTPP, and it was pulled out, of course. So I think that part will also tie in with what Dr. Nehru was saying, right? He was saying that, tie in certain provisions and increase the services trade. And the CPTPP does some of that, at least the original version, and it was, of course, soon rectified. It was watered down a bit. So I think that was actually quite good, and more of such engagement is very worthwhile in my opinion. So that is what I have to say on that matter. Thank you.
And thank you. Co-Chair Shriver.
Thank you. Dr. Nehru, I wanted to ask a couple questions on transshipment. You made a comment in your oral statement, and it's probably in here somewhere in your written statement, but that you expected, now I'm rephrasing my words, you expected the problem of transshipment to attenuate a bit because the cooperation of Southeast Asian countries in helping us deal with the problem. We've had meetings and travel where actually just the opposite was suggested, that and it could have been the particular interlocutors, but it was basically transshipment is your problem. If we're making money off this, of course we're going to do it. So I just wanted to get your assessment on the appetite for cooperation truly on the part of our Southeast Asian friends and partners.
Well, my statement that Southeast Asian authorities wanted to reduce transshipment is based on press reports that I've been able to read. I don't have any direct contact with the authorities in those countries specifically focused on this. But especially in Vietnam, when this was brought to the attention of the Vietnamese made it a policy commitment of theirs, at least as far as these press reports were concerned, made it a policy commitment of theirs to try and reduce transshipment because they recognized that it had a big impact on the reputation of all Vietnamese exporters. And there were large reputational risks for the country. And I think the same would apply to Malaysia and certainly to Singapore. Those are also incidentally two countries which are seen as having, as operating as transshipment ports. Just a quick point about the estimate of transshipment. This estimate is just an estimate. These are difficult things to identify specifically, which is why the CBP finds it so difficult to actually identify and detect them. What the analysts did was used very detailed trade data down to 8-digit harmonized system levels, which is, like ballpoint pens or whatever have you, and seen whether within a quarter you had a sharp increase in imports into a country and then a sharp increase in exports. and that the lower amount of the two was then seen as subject to potential transshipment. So the lower bound that we have of 7.5%, the upper bound of 16%, the 16% is probably an overestimation, the 7.5% is probably a very conservative estimation, but these are just estimates based on trade data, because it's very difficult to actually get a handle on specifics on this unless domestic authorities are seriously involved in detecting this kind of activity.
Well, thank you for that clarification, and that's the basis for the question is, how confident can we be to have their cooperation? I think there's sufficient concern in Congress about this issue, that there's an interest in addressing it, perhaps through legislation. And if you could expand a bit on the difficulty of detecting, accounting for, measuring, because it seems to me there's a spectrum of, some final product comes in from China and you slap, a label on it that says it's from Vietnam, not from China, and you send it along its way. That's clearly sanctions evasion, tariff evasion, illegal. But if China comes in and invests, builds a factory, hires people, builds something, and it's Chinese capital, but it's produced now somewhere else, Vietnam, that's perfectly fine. But there's a middle ground of what if they're sending component parts for final assembly and then shipped it. So if you were to have a recommendation to the Congress or have us make a recommendation to the Congress, what is the problem that we should be cracking down on, and how do you build this sort of infrastructure for detecting and then leveling penalties?
So this is an age-old problem of international trade and international trade agreements to determine what are called rules of origin, or ROOs, R-O-Os, ROOs. And virtually all trade agreements normally have a minimum amount of value added that needs to take place in a country before it can avail itself of, say, lower tariffs under the trade agreement. The problem in the case of the United States is it doesn't have a trade agreement with Southeast Asian economies. It withdrew from the TPP, but if it had stayed within the TPP, as currently, for example, RCEP has a 40% rule, that is a 40% value-added requirement. If that requirement is met within RCEP, then a product can be produced anywhere within the RCEP members and can be exported to any country within the RCEP membership and still avail itself of the RCEP special tariffs. The United States has to reach an agreement on what it considers to be an appropriate level of value added locally before it can avail itself of its tariffs or zero tariffs or whatever have you within the United States. And that requires negotiation and agreement so that both sides are clear on the level of the rule as well as how it is to be determined, because that too requires a significant amount of expertise and sort of technical determination, because these are also not necessarily easy things. But there are now, I looked at it, something like over 300 trading arrangements now in the world, and virtually all of them have rules of origin and methods by which rules can be determined. And so this is not something that is new. It's been done in the past and can be done in the case of Southeast Asia.
Thank you.
And Commissioner Brands.
Dr. Nehru, you advocated in your written testimony that the U.S. pursue a framework for economic engagement with Southeast Asia, and we consistently hear that there's a strong demand signal from Southeast Asian countries for expanded economic ties. Of course, we're also in a world where sort of big trade deals seem infeasible politically. So could you just sketch out a little bit of sort of what that framework looks like in your mind within the framework, within the limits of the politically possible at the moment?
Well, as Dr. Kuok this morning mentioned, there already is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which has these 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean economy, and a inclusive economy. I think those are the 4 pillars. And I'm not suggesting that the IPEF necessarily continue, but that provides a useful benchmark against which to measure any new arrangement that may be negotiated. The point is that even in the trade pillar, where very little progress, frankly, has been made under IPEF, the objective should be to try and move towards a trade agreement of the kind where you have rules of origin determined, you have transshipment issues laid out and so forth. But recognizing that we're not going to get there simply because of the atmosphere on both sides of the Pacific, if you wish. But that should be the ultimate objective, and one should then measure progress in baby steps along that way. So I think my one sort of suggestion would be to be patient with respect to negotiations, make small steps towards this agreement, and that's about the only thing that I can suggest given the lack of enthusiasm for a trade agreement with Southeast Asia.
What about a couple of the additional recommendations you made in your written testimony involved a sort of high standard security framework to protect dual use technologies and critical minerals agreements. So could you just expand a little bit more on what you have in mind there?
Well, as you know, the policy under the CHIPS Act was that the U.S. could not import any critical minerals as well as any components unless they were from countries with which the United States had a free trade agreement. And yet many of those critical minerals are in fact produced in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, suggested that there be a limited critical minerals agreement with the United States, but this was, I think, rejected out of hand. There is, it is possible for example, Japan to provide inputs into these sensitive industries because Japan has the appropriate safeguards to ensure that technology is not leaked to adversaries. But not even Korea is included in that very privileged group. What I was suggesting was that the United States should work with at least some of these countries, the more advanced countries which have a greater likelihood of introducing those safeguards, to work with them to make sure that those safeguards reach a standard which are acceptable to the United States, so that these countries can then participate in the supply chain for these very sensitive industries. So that's what I was referring to with respect to the high-tech, as well as what I was referring to with respect to the critical minerals arrangement. I think the critical minerals arrangement issue, by the way, can very quickly be resolved. I don't think it should be a big issue. It's unfortunately, I think, was rejected out of hand earlier.
Great. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Friedberg.
Thank you. Dr. Nehru, in your written testimony, you talked about the question of whether Chinese companies were beginning to establish production facilities in third countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, rather than simply transshipping. To what extent are Chinese companies that are involved in this kind of activity transferring technology or knowledge or skills that may allow for the development of indigenous capacity in those countries?
Well, I don't have any particular insight into how much of that technology spillovers are taking place, but the experience of Southeast Asia in the past, especially in Vietnam, has been that those spillovers can be pretty significant if they are indeed, if these companies are located coterminously, if you wish, if there are agglomeration economies where there is technological spillovers simply take place with respect to observing, conversations outside work, and so forth and so on. I mean, Southeast Asia is a very good example of how foreign direct investment, especially if located within industrial estates where there's a high concentration of firms and cluster economies, can lead to significant technology spillovers. But we must recognize that technology spillovers take an extremely long time because technologies appropriately are protected under IPR and all the rest of it. But that there is also learning by doing that takes place. Personnel who work in these companies learn and take that knowledge outside those companies, and that's how ideas and technology spread. So I am pretty confident that as Chinese companies invest in Southeast Asia, as many Western companies have, that those technologies are likely to have the same dissemination across the economy over time.
This is another question for you, but also for Dr. Lim, if you'd care to comment. I believe in your written testimony, I'm sorry, now I'm not sure which of you it was, but made the point that Western companies, in fact, have not always done very well at transferring skills or technology to the countries in which they locate facilities, so that China may not be unique if it is withholding some of that technology.
Let me respond, and then we can go to our other presenter. In fact, I would suggest it may be the other way around. One of the big complaints I pick up from policymakers in Southeast Asia is that quite often Chinese investors demand that their skilled workers, their middle managers are all from mainland China. They claim it's because of language and because they have the skills and so forth. But one of the consequences is that there's very few technological spillovers that take place. I'll give you one example, and that is the famous Morawali industrial estate that I mentioned in my paper. 35,000 hectares, huge numbers of smelters and so forth. There's a Chinese hotel, there are Chinese dormitories, there are Chinese workers, there are Chinese managers. And while there are obviously some Indonesians there, the bulk of the technological capacity is Chinese. And I don't believe there's that much effort, even on the part of the Indonesians, to try and extract some of that technological knowledge for the benefit of their own workers and managers.
And again, do you have any insight into how that would compare with the behavior of other Western companies?
Well, obviously, Western companies are not that keen to give up their technologies. But on the other hand, they recognize that in order to be efficient, one of the reasons why they locate in these countries is to get access to cheap labor, to get access to cheap management. And so they have to train them. They have to give them those skills in order to be competitive and to make that investment a productive investment. And so it's in the very nature of the model of foreign direct investment that you have to give up some of that technical capacity to local workers and to local managers. And so I think, as I said, Southeast Asia is an exemplar of how these technologies spread. And much of that investment so far has been by Western investors, not by Chinese investors.
Thank you. Dr. Lim.
Thank you. I think with regards to that question, right, the last question was that I would say virtually all transnational corporations will not willingly transfer technology to whichever place that they invest in. I think that is simply capitalism. Whether you're European, Japanese, American, Chinese, it doesn't really matter. A lot has to go down to willpower from the domestic states. I think if you look at Morowali, which was mentioned just now, you see basically, in a sense, it's very free market, right? Because it's so free market, Chinese investors get to do what they, what was mentioned, right? Bringing in their own laborers, middle managers. Of course, there are reasons for that, right? Because Morowali is kind of far away, and to quickly commission a project, you need people, right? And a lot of them is from the home economies, right? But how this will evolve in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, we don't really know. If you look at most of the transnational corporations in Southeast Asia, at the beginning there will be quite a huge influx of people from the home country, and over time they will hire more local. So with regards to the Chinese, I think they may evolve in that pathway, right? Because bringing all your people is not cheap. Is not cheap. So that is a key consideration. And the other thing is that if you consider the example of Japan in recent times, very recent times, what they did, and this was in late 2023, it was the launching of the ASEAN-Japan Co-Creation Initiative for the Next Generation Automotive Industry. So this is where supposedly Japan and the various Southeast Asian governments, they come together and they decide to build the next generation vehicle. You can call it EV or by other names. I think this is something that can be considered, right? So there is policy encouragement, policy inducement, because you can't really force companies to do what you want them to do. They have to be willing partners. So this is one way of doing it. I think Japan is quite good in this, and you can see that in the streets of most Asian cities. Most of the cars that you see are essentially Japanese. BYD, yes, one or two, but generally it's a Japanese castle. A Korean guy used to tell me that, yeah, this is a Japanese castle. We cannot touch the Japanese castle. Thank you.
And Commissioner Goodwin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, my appreciation to the witnesses for their testimony. Dr. Nehru, I want to return to a discussion of the policy recommendations you make in your testimony. And as you introduce them, you point out that the recommendations would all be designed to serve one overarching objective, which is the long-term strategic and economic best interests of the United States. And then you point out that a fundamental assumption underlying that strategic objective is that a strong, stable, and prosperous Southeast Asia, one that is open, engaged, and even competitive with the United States, is in the United States' best interest. Do you think the U.S. accepts that premise? That is, do you think that our policies currently reflect that assumption?
Well, the nature of policy recommendations are what they should be as opposed to what they actually are. But I think to a very large extent, over the last 30 to 40 years, and I've been working on Southeast Asia for that length of time, I think there has been a consistent effort, except for a few notable periods, where, yes, the United States has worked for the prosperity of Southeast Asia. It's true, there's many Southeast Asian economies are now part of the WTO. One of the reasons why Southeast Asia seems so comfortable with the world economic order is because they've benefited greatly from it. Just as China has benefited greatly from it. An order in which there are rules for trade, for investment, and so forth. And as I say in my testimony, as I mentioned earlier, that Southeast Asia has one of the highest trade to GDP ratios in the world, even higher than the EU. So clearly the world order has significantly helped, and the United States has been a prime mover of that world order. So my submission would be, my sense is that the United States has, over the last several decades, tried to achieve the prosperity of Southeast Asia, and recognition of the fact that that would also serve the interests of the United States. I'm not sure whether you'd agree with me on that, but I'd be interested in your views.
Well, yeah, the benefit of today's proceedings is that you're on the hot seat and I get to ask these tough questions, right? I do want to follow up. What about the countries in the region? That is, do you think they believe that we believe that? You touched on some of the public polling that came out in 2024 and shifting trends with regard to views of the United States vis-a-vis China. So do you think countries and policymakers in the region believe that we believe that their economic prosperity and security is in America and the world's best interest?
So one must start with the premise, of course, and it's worth constantly re-emphasizing this. The Southeast Asia is made up of 10 extremely diverse economies with very diverse views on this issue. And there are clearly countries in Southeast Asia which are completely within the orbit of the Chinese and are unwilling to accept anything other than the dominance of the Chinese, and I'm referring here primarily to Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar, for example. And there are also countries like Singapore, now Vietnam, the Philippines, where there's a strong view about the critical importance of the United States as underpinning the economic and security order within Southeast Asia. And I would place somewhere in between the countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia, where I think they recognize the critical importance of the United States. They have sort of their relations are always hedged between the United States and China, but they also recognize the fact that China is geographically close. It is growing very rapidly. It provides critical technologies. It helps these countries with their aspirations to become high-income economies. But ultimately, I think there's this variety of views within Southeast Asia with respect to the United States. Some would agree with the view that the United States is working to benefit Southeast Asia, and others might not have that same view and would provide the same rubric to the Chinese. I'm not sure if it answers your question.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nehru. Thank you for coming, and thank you to all the witnesses. I got to remember to keep my glasses on when I'm reading questions. What role do you think, Dr. Nehru, what role in Southeast Asia is Southeast Asia playing in sanctions and export control evasion in your view?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. What role is Southeast Asia playing in sanctions and export control evasion?
What role is Southeast Asia playing in
sanctions and export control evasion?
Sanctions and export control evasion. That is evasion of export controls imposed by the United States.
Yes.
I am not aware of any such evasion, but I haven't kept a very close eye on this. I'm not sure exactly whether you're referring to a particular issue here.
Okay, that's fine. Let me ask you another question then. How has expansion and investment in Southeast Asia contributed to the global economies of scale for Chinese firms?
Chinese firms have attained global scale well before they started investing in Southeast Asia. I think one must recognize, by the way, that a lot of the relocation of investments in China, manufacturing investment in China to Southeast Asia were in fact from Western companies, not Chinese companies. These were American companies, Japanese companies, European companies, who initially found that the rise in real wages was simply making them internationally uncompetitive, and therefore chose to relocate to Southeast Asia, primarily Vietnam, but also to some other countries, to regain their competitive advantage. This process was then accelerated by some of the tensions between China and Japan initially, where Japan introduced the China +1 policy, trying to move some of their investments out. And subsequently, of course, with the introduction of tariffs in 2018, the US tariffs I'm talking about in 2018, which accelerated that process even further. So this has been a long-standing process. And it's not just, as I mentioned, Chinese firms. It's very much initially were Western firms. Chinese firms have now been relocating, in part stimulated by the US tariffs.
Thank you, and I'll give back the balance of my time.
Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. I'd like to, Dr. Nehru, I'd like to go back to the discussion you were having with Commissioner Brands about a critical mineral deal. We just returned from the region. We're going to be going back to the region in a few weeks. There were 10 minutes that went by but that we didn't hear some sort of talk about how important a critical minerals deal should be. But we had a very difficult time actually getting to what that would mean and what could actually get us across the finish line. Certainly, there's an appetite on the U.S. side for more critical minerals. There's an appetite on Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, for example, obviously, for an export market that allowed them to diversify away from the reliance on China. But what else is needed to push this across the finish line? And I'm asking because this sounds like a great idea, but it's not deemed attractive enough to get the attention of this administration, at least yet. If you were given the mandate to try to help get this thing over the finish line, what recommendation would you have? Would it be based on constraining Chinese operations in the country, providing more transparency around what the Chinese processors are doing? Would it be based more around proactive steps to create a bigger export market in the Indonesias of the region in order to create more potential exports coming in from the United States? How would you advise getting past the finish line?
So my suggestion is very simple, actually. There are 7 industrial estates that have been set up in Indonesia to promote downstream nickel processing, and not just nickel processing, but processing of other mineral ores which can no longer be exported from the country. Only 3 of those are currently operational: Halmahera, Morowali, and there's one island of Obe. 4 are not yet operational. My suggestion would be that if the United States can reach an agreement with Indonesia to get one of those industrial estates for only US investors, where US investors can install environmental standards which are in consonance with United States standards, that US investors can introduce investments which meet the governance standards, and the transparency standards which the US demands. Just as China dominates these 3, the United States could potentially get one of these industrial estates where it can get sufficiently large amounts of US investment, US standards, and then you can have verification of those standards for those products to be exported to the United States. There is absolutely no reason why this cannot be achieved.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. Let's go back up to 30,000 feet and talk about Belt and Road. And this is a question for both of you. Belt and Road is very different now than it was when it was first created, over a decade ago, and when Xi Jinping first put a stamp of approval on it. The Chinese financial backdrop is very different. There were enormous amounts of Forex reserves, 4 trillion or so, with another trillion in the banking system. So the dynamic for wanting to get Belt and Road going was about not just recycling excess surpluses for Forex, for commodities, other things. It's different now. The Chinese state is much more capital constrained, and what we've been seeing around the world has been sort of a de-emphasis of Belt and Road, a lot of failures associated with bad managerial oversight of Belt and Road. So it's a very different environment. That said, what's been very clear in your testimonies has been that it plays a very strong role in Southeast Asia. So perhaps around the world, Belt and Road isn't what it once was, or it doesn't have the emphasis in Beijing of what it once was, but in Southeast Asia, it still plays a very important role. How would you distinguish, obviously Southeast Asia is the near abroad for China, but how would you distinguish your view of how Belt and Road is doing right now in 2025 in Southeast Asia versus perhaps the rest of the world where there's maybe a declining emphasis?
I will answer your question, but with some caveats. It's always very difficult to define what is a Belt and Road project as opposed to what is not, especially in the past. But given that, there has been a transition in the kind of projects that the BRI has been supporting. The first has been primarily transport. It's rail, it's roads, ports, and airports. But there's been a significant shift recognizing precisely the point that you're making, that many of these projects have not been as successful as they were originally thought. There has been some pushback on the part of countries, especially in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia and elsewhere. And so there has been the shift to what is now considered to be, in fact, an even higher priority as far as China is concerned, and that is the digital Silk Road. That is introducing, focusing on investments in the digital sector. And there's been, I'm talking about literally the last couple of years, a very substantial increase in investments, not just, by the way, on the part of China, but also on the part of the United States quite separately. So there is this intense competition for Southeast Asian markets. Some of that competition, unfortunately, is now waning simply because the United States has incentives, US investors have incentives now to locate within the United States because of some of the barriers introduced. So China has somewhat more of an open playing field with respect to Southeast Asia, but that's where a lot of the action of the BRI is. And questions like localization laws, privacy concerns, management of the data, data governance, these are all issues at which China is at the discussion table, not the United States, unfortunately, because China is the one introducing many of these investments. And I'll be very frank with you that the leaders of Southeast Asian economies find China's use of many of these high-tech surveillance instruments as very useful for their own purposes. So there is a meeting of the minds as to how data should be used, both for the stability of the state as well as for the promotion of the market. And that makes for a relatively easy discussion between Southeast Asian leaders and the Chinese.
Okay. Do we have time for Dr. Lim to Dr. Lim?
Thank you. With regards to the Belt and Road, I think I agree with Dr. Nehru in the sense that it's basically a catch-all, and I've never yet come across a Chinese project or Chinese firm that says, "Hey, I'm not part of the Belt and Road," right? Because it's just a signaling thing, and everyone wants to be in rather than out, right? And if you were to look at the longer-term evolution, right, you realize that there has been a lot of wastage at the early stages, right? If you count 2013, right, and between 2013 and 2025 today, there's been some projects, a lot of projects, I would say, that are basically wasteful, inefficient. And I think the companies themselves, right, the Chinese companies themselves and their affiliates, they are learning to rationalize, to experiment, basically learning by doing. And as a result, the projects have become more and more rationalized, right? And that is not a bad thing. If you look at, say, Japan, right? Japan in the 80s was basically seen as a rival by some Western governments. And over time, right, that worry is no longer a worry, no longer a concern, simply because there is a lot of learning by doing as well. There's a lot of experimenting. And I think the Japanese companies, they learned how to manage this, basically this pot of money in foreign environments, right? I think people kind of not notice the similarity between Japan and China in this regard. And to a smaller extent, you could extend the argument to the new southbound policies of Korea and Taiwan, right? Similarly, large capital surplus, and you have to, recycle it or channel it abroad. And broadly speaking, they have seen same evolutionary tracks, right? At the start, it is big, even boastful at one point. But over a period of, say, 10 years, 20 years, they have become more and more market, more attuned to the market sentiments. And, before we forget, right, if you just proxy the Belt and Road, whatever the definition is, if we just look at foreign direct investment, it's not particularly that big in Southeast Asia. It has become bigger. But the others have also maintained their presence or even increased their presence, right? I think American FDI is one of them. Japanese FDI is also one of them, right? So in that sense, you could say that everyone wins in this exercise. And that is my comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Commissioner Stivers.
Dr. Nehru, you mentioned, and I totally agree, that the U.S. should lean into our commanding advantages and not try to emulate China, especially on economic and trade policy. I think this is a common theme that we've gotten from all of our panels. So on foreign direct investment, we've heard a lot over the years about how this is a commanding advantage from the U.S., Japan, our allies that we have in Southeast Asia over China. But in our previous panel, or one of our previous panels, it was said that the FDI advantage was not so significant because it was concentrated so much in Singapore. And I'd like to get your views on if you agree with that. You know, is FDI from U.S. and our allies, is that a commanding advantage? And if so, how do we lean into it?
Well, yes, I believe it is a commanding advantage. And yes, you're quite right that Singapore receives the bulk of U.S. investment in Southeast Asia. But Singapore is, if you'll pardon the expression, a transshipment point for that investment. Companies in Singapore happens to be the largest foreign direct investor in the rest of Southeast Asia. So the same companies that get capital from the United States or elsewhere then reinvest that money in Southeast Asia. And they use, of course, Singapore's proximity to manage those investments in Southeast Asia, but they also use the Singaporean court system to resolve disputes. They are supported by Singaporean law. They're supported by Singaporean requirements for governance and standards. And that's why they choose to locate in Southeast Asia. Now choose to locate in Singapore. Now, having said that, there are still big challenges because in many countries in Southeast Asia, judicial standards for governance, transparency are unfortunately extremely weak. I'll give you an example. You can have a case which is resolved in a Singaporean court, but to implement the judgment, you actually have to go then, say, to an Indonesian court or to a court in another Southeast Asian country. And getting judgments implemented is extremely difficult when it's a cross-border decision of this kind. So it's not always easy. So one of the big things that the U.S. government can do to support U.S. service providers is by reaching agreements on some of the ways by which dispute resolution can be done in ways that are transparent and fair and clear, that judgments made, say, in Singaporean courts should be implemented with alacrity, if you wish, quickly, etc. So there are all sorts of ways by which the U.S. government can support private sector service providers from the United States and the rest of Southeast Asia. And as I mentioned, there are a litany of restrictions on service providers in the rest of Southeast Asia. It is surprising to me that, that these countries have not seen the advantages of allowing foreign investors, especially U.S. service providers coming in, to improve the quality of services in Southeast Asian economies.
Thanks. I want to expand that a little bit, but also kind of focus it on trade and bring in Dr. Lim. I agree, Commissioner Brands, that we shouldn't spend too much time on multilateral trade agreements at this point because they're just not realistic in this political environment, for good or for bad. But it should be noted that only 4 of the 10 or 11 ASEAN countries are part of CPTPP, and Indonesia, the largest economy in ASEAN, is not part of it. Thailand, the Philippines, and often they are worried that they will be at a disadvantage in an environment where the more wealthy countries join a multilateral trade agreement and the middle income or low income countries do not. But this gets directly to the issue of standards and trade. If bilateral trade agreements are possible with the U.S. and possibly some of our larger allies like Japan, do these, especially the middle income countries, I'm thinking the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand in particular, did they have the basic customs enforcement or standards that can enable them to enter into a trade agreement that could hopefully be mutually advantageous? And does it make sense for the U.S. to provide that technical capacity building support to help these countries, have higher standards? Maybe we can start with Dr. Lim on this one.
Thank you. I think you are right. A lot of us we may not have the capacity to do, better standards of trade, better standards of governance. We do not really have that. And I think if you look at capacity building, I think one guy that always is there is Japan, right? Japan provides quite generous ODA, and some of that ODA goes back to capacity building and all those. So in that sense, I think if you look at American aid, I know there's a lot happening behind, but over the last 10 or 20 years, it has not really been that much channel over to Southeast Asia. So I think that is something worth considering. It may not be the same thing, but if a close enough substitute can be found, that should be good. But again, I don't know American politics that well, but I do know that this is something that has to be considered, right? And I think it's also a very gradual process, right? Because it is not so realistic if we say, okay, let's do this today, and if there are no results in 6 to 8 months' time, and we chuck the whole initiative out, I think that is very reactionary. That's very, very reactionary. So it would be good to have a longer term perspective, right? And again, Japan is actually quite good in that, right? I know some people say, yeah, the Chinese do, but I think if you look at Japan does it quite okay as well, right? And believe me or not, a lot of what the Chinese do are actually, I wouldn't say copycats, but there's a lot of policy emulation from Japan. So I think that is something that could be referenced towards, right? Whether it's training, right? Capacity building and all those, right? So I will end there. Thank you.
So I would differentiate between a trade agreement focusing on merchandise goods and one focusing on services. On merchandise goods, as you well know, tariffs tend to be very low on average, even in Southeast Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia. It's behind the border barriers that's the real issue. And to be honest, the Southeast Asians are very good at introducing behind the border barriers in ways that restrict imports, but which are not overt and therefore they can't be brought to account, so to speak. But the case of the United States is to have agreements actually on services trade, which is where it has its comparative advantage. And there the issues are very different. You don't need customs to determine whether services should be or can be provided or not. For example, setting up design companies, accountancy companies, architectural companies in Southeast Asia, US companies that is, that should be allowed. These are services provided which should be allowed. They're not in many instances. To allow companies in Southeast Asia to hire financiers, top managers, other service providers, legal experts, and so forth, these are quite often not allowed because the worry is that domestic expertise will not be used. So there are many ways by which you can actually level the playing field for service providers in these countries, which do not require custom. They just require a change in regulations and an observance of those regulations. That is true, but that's much easier to police, so to speak, than is required for merchandise goods.
Do any commissioners have any further questions? Yeah.
Sorry, I hate to be the last question, but I do have one other question. Back on trade, RCEP. It was the trade agreement between countries in ASEAN and China, which I believe went into effect in 2022. I'm sorry.
It was ratified in 2022.
Okay. It seems to have, so according to your testimony and the statistics that I've seen, China's exports to the region skyrocketed since that time and wiped out any natural trade advantages and a trade surplus that many countries in ASEAN had with China. Is this timing just a coincidence, or did RCEP and the tenets of that trade agreement contribute to this change in the trade relationship between China and these countries?
Well, I'm well aware that there are many experts on the Chinese economy in this room, and I'm not, sorry?
Of which I am not one.
Okay. It is a combination, my view is that it is a combination of the introduction of RCEP. Yes, it certainly facilitated trade enormously, but it is also a reflection of the fact that the post-pandemic stimulus that was provided by the Chinese authorities have led to a substantial increase in investments, which have led to excess capacity, which have nothing to do with Southeast Asia, nothing to do with RCEP, and everything to do with the stimulus. The unfortunate thing, and I've worked a lot in China, by the way, and one of the unfortunate features of the Chinese system is that the stimulus measures that they're capable of introducing quickly tend to be on the supply side, not on the demand side. And so, unfortunately, the supply has been increased very substantially. Demand has not. Now they're trying to play catch up, trying to introduce measures to increase demand to try and soak up some of that excess capacity. So it was a combination of both, the RCEP as well as the stimulus.
And there's a lot more stimulus coming in terms of...
I don't believe so. I don't believe there's a lot more stimulus coming. I believe they now have to work off this excess capacity, which exists in a wide range of areas, but particularly in real estate, which happens nothing to do with trade at all. But the excess capacity tends to be in battery production, in EVs, in petrochemicals, in a whole range of those sorts of products. But I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a shakeout, just as there was a shakeout in the real estate industry. There's going to be a shakeout in the EV industry. There's going to be a shakeout in the battery industry. There's even going to be a shakeout in petrochemicals. And by the way, that shakeout is not restricted to firms just within China. They would include firms that have invested in Southeast Asia. So there could be some fallout for Southeast Asia as that shakeout takes place.
Thank you.
Dr. Lim, did you have any final remarks or final thoughts?
No, not at all.
Okay. So in closing, I want to thank Dr. Lim for participating in the middle of the night with us today, and to Dr. Nehru, thank you for being here in person. And to all of our witnesses today that we heard from today, I want to thank them as well for their testimonies. We're going to use all of this to inform our deliberations and preparations of our report this year. You can find these testimonies as well as the recording of the hearing on our website. I'd like to note that the Commission's next hearing will take place on Thursday, April 3rd. That hearing is titled, "The Rocket's Red Glare, China's Ambitions to Dominate Space." And with that, we are adjourned.